Hi everyone, welcome to Midnight Cases. I know you can't sleep, so I'll keep you company with crime stories from around the world. Before we get into the story, comment where you're listening from. And if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. I'm going to tell you the story of a woman whose crimes shook England in ways that few could imagine. Her name was Joanna. She appeared ordinary, intelligent, and charming to those around her. But behind that facade was a predator who killed not for money, not for revenge, but for the pure thrill of taking life. Her story is chilling, complex, and haunting, a story that forced a nation to confront the reality of violence carried out by someone who seemed outwardly ordinary. Joanna Dennehy was born in March 1982 in Hereford, England. Her early childhood was marked by neglect, instability, and loneliness. She grew up in a household where warmth and affection were scarce. Reports from neighbors and family indicate that she was often left to her own devices, developing habits and behaviors without proper guidance. As a child, Joanna displayed a fascination with death and violence. She was curious about disturbing stories and sometimes acted in ways that frightened other children. Teachers described her as intelligent, articulate, but capable of sudden aggression and cruelty. Even at a young age, she demonstrated an unusual capacity for manipulation and control. During adolescence, Joanna's behavior became increasingly erratic. She ran away from home multiple times and had early encounters with authorities for minor thefts, truancy, and assault. She developed a reputation as unpredictable and aggressive. At school, she often dominated social interactions, drawing in peers with charm while simultaneously intimidating them. Relationships were intense but short-lived, often involving control and coercion. These patterns reflected traits that would later manifest in far more extreme ways. By her late teens and early 20s, Joanna had begun experimenting with relationships that involved aggression and manipulation. She drifted through jobs and short-term residences, cultivating a life that appeared normal on the surface but allowed her freedom to pursue darker impulses. Those who knew her described her as attractive, intelligent, and capable of great charm, but also unpredictable and sometimes frightening. She was socially adept, able to lure strangers into trust, a skill that would later make her murders possible. In 2013, Joanna's violent impulses escalated dramatically. Over a period of several months, she committed a series of murders in and around her local area. Her victims were all men who she selected based on opportunity, vulnerability, and the potential for control. The first victim, Anthony King, was a man she lured to a secluded area under false pretenses. She attacked him violently, stabbing him repeatedly until he died. The brutality of the attack shocked investigators, who later noted that her methods were both impulsive and precise, reflecting a complex mix of compulsion and calculation. The second victim, Kevin Lee, was similarly chosen for his accessibility. Joanna used charm to gain his trust, leading him to a location where she could carry out the murder. Again, she demonstrated control and detachment, leaving the scene in a calm and composed manner. The third victim, John Chapman, was attacked in a way that mirrored the earlier killings, showing a clear pattern in her methodology. Each murder involved luring, physical assault, and complete domination over the victim. Joanna's lack of remorse and the pleasure she appeared to take in the acts themselves struck fear into the local community once the murders became known. What made Joanna particularly terrifying was the way she maintained normalcy in her daily life. She interacted with family, friends, and strangers as if nothing had happened, blending charm with menace in a way that kept suspicion away. People around her noticed nothing unusual, while investigators were left trying to piece together connections between victims who, on the surface, seemed unrelated. Her ability to manipulate perception, hide evidence, and continue everyday life was a hallmark of her psychopathy. Investigators gradually uncovered the scale of Joanna's crimes. They collected forensic evidence from crime scenes, interviewed neighbors and acquaintances, and tracked her movements through CCTV and electronic records. They discovered that she had accomplices at different points, men who were drawn into her orbit through a mix of coercion, manipulation, and complicity. These accomplices were critical in revealing the step-by-step details of her attacks, from how she lured victims to the locations where she carried out the murders. As police pieced together the timeline, a horrifying picture emerged. Joanna had killed with a combination of impulsive violence and meticulous planning. She had no clear motive beyond the thrill of control and domination. Her methods involved stabbing, strangulation, and manipulation, leaving victims with little chance of escape. The community became gripped by fear as news of the murders spread, particularly because her victims were seemingly random men, often living alone or vulnerable in other ways. Joanna was arrested in March 2013 after police linked the murders and located evidence pointing directly to her involvement. Her demeanor during arrest was calm and unnerving. She laughed during interviews, smiled, and exhibited the kind of cold detachment that terrified investigators. Psychologists later diagnosed her with traits of extreme psychopathy, sexual sadism, and antisocial personality disorder. Her ability to manipulate, deceive, and dominate those around her was central to her criminal behavior. The trial of Joanna Dennehy was one of the most high-profile cases in recent English criminal history. Courtrooms were filled with media and spectators. Detailed forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and accomplice accounts painted a clear picture of her crimes. Experts provided psychological analysis, explaining how her upbringing, personality traits, and compulsions combined to create one of the rarest examples of female serial killers. She showed no remorse, laughed at questioning, and displayed a chilling sense of control throughout the proceedings. Joanna was convicted of 3 murders and received a life sentence without possibility of parole. The judge described her crimes as exceptionally rare, horrifying, and without precedent in modern England. Families of the victims, while relieved at her conviction, remained traumatized by the brutality and unpredictability of her actions. Communities struggled with the realization that a person who seemed ordinary could commit such calculated, senseless violence. Her legacy is studied widely in criminology, psychology, and law enforcement. Joanna Dennehy's case provides rare insight into the mindset of female serial killers, the ability to manipulate systems and individuals, and the terrifying consequences of psychopathy combined with charm. Her story reminds society that evil does not always look monstrous and that appearances can deceive. Even today, Joanna remains in prison, studied, feared, and remembered as one of England's most disturbing serial killers. Her story, from troubled childhood to horrifying murders and public trial, serves as a chilling reminder that human depravity can sometimes exist behind the most ordinary faces. Her life is dissected by psychologists, law enforcement, and criminologists seeking to understand how someone could commit such atrocities while outwardly blending seamlessly into society. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Leonard, a man whose crimes terrified Melbourne in the 1980s. Leonard Fraser appeared ordinary at first glance, quiet, unassuming, and socially polite. Yet beneath that exterior lurked a mind consumed by compulsion, violence, and an obsession with control. His victims were women, often young and vulnerable, many working in situations where society offered them little protection. To the world, he seemed like any other man walking the streets, but to those he targeted, he became a predator, a force of horror that could strike without warning. Leonard Fraser was born in 1951 in Australia. His early years were shaped by neglect and instability. His family environment was harsh and unkind. Leonard's parents were strict, often punishing him severely for minor misbehavior, while emotional warmth and guidance were rare. From a young age, he exhibited troubling behaviors, fascination with control, obsession with power over others, and a capacity for aggression beyond what was typical for his age. Neighbors and teachers noted that Leonard could be charming and intelligent, but he also had unpredictable violent tendencies, especially when confronted or challenged. During adolescence, Leonard struggled to form normal social connections. He drifted from school to school, showing a pattern of conflict with authority figures. Early in life, he engaged in petty crimes such as theft, minor assaults, and deceitful manipulation of peers. These acts, while relatively minor, indicated a growing disregard for rules, empathy, and human life. Leonard also began to show signs of sexual deviation, a fascination with domination, and a compulsion to exert control over those weaker than himself. By the time Leonard reached adulthood, his behavior had become more structured and methodical. He held odd jobs, maintained casual social interactions, and presented an appearance of normalcy that allowed him to blend seamlessly into society. Yet beneath this ordinary exterior, he began targeting women who were vulnerable. Many of his victims were sex workers, a population often overlooked and marginalized, making them easier targets. He would observe, select, and plan before acting, ensuring he had maximum control over the situation. Leonard's method was chilling. He would approach women on the streets or in places they frequented, offering assistance, friendship, or employment. He gained their trust slowly, using charm, patience, and manipulation. Once isolated, he would abduct them, often taking them to remote locations, abandoned buildings, or isolated areas outside the city where he could commit his crimes without interference. He assaulted them, sometimes repeatedly, before killing them in brutal and calculated ways. Afterward, he often disposed of the bodies carefully, hiding them in remote locations, sometimes in shallow graves or natural bushland. Each victim followed a similar story, but each tragedy had its own horror. Some were young women struggling to survive on the streets. Others were temporarily alone, seeking work or safety. Leonard's careful planning allowed him to exploit their vulnerabilities. The randomness of his selection from the outside world made him unpredictable, a constant shadow of fear to women walking alone in Melbourne. He became known as a predator who could strike without warning, and this uncertainty paralyzed communities and heightened the public sense of vulnerability. The city of Melbourne in the 1980s provided a complex backdrop. Rapid urbanization, social inequality, and marginalized populations created opportunities for predators to operate unnoticed. Leonard exploited these social dynamics. He moved through society seamlessly, never arousing suspicion, appearing polite and ordinary. This normalcy was crucial. It allowed him to continue his crimes over several years without immediate detection. Police investigations began to intensify as patterns emerged. Reports of missing women, particularly those in vulnerable situations, began to accumulate. Witnesses describe a man who had approached victims, sometimes helping them, sometimes offering assistance or guidance. Forensic teams collected evidence from discovery sites, noting the locations, methods of disposal, and signs of repeated violent behavior. Detectives mapped out his movements, interactions, and behavioral patterns. They studied the victim's last known whereabouts, piecing together a trail that led closer and closer to Leonard. Eventually, Leonard Fraser was identified as a suspect. Law enforcement used interviews, surveillance, and careful psychological profiling to anticipate his behavior. When police confronted him, he initially denied involvement. But under pressure and confronted with mounting evidence, he confessed to multiple murders, providing detailed accounts of how he selected victims, lured them, committed the assaults, and disposed of their bodies. Psychologists later examined Leonard, noting his lack of empathy, manipulativeness, sexual sadism, and compulsive desire for control as central to his behavior. The trial was high profile, capturing the attention of the nation. Courtrooms were filled with spectators, media, and family members of victims. Witnesses testified about Leonard's manipulative interactions, the terror he caused, and his ability to appear harmless while committing atrocities. Forensic experts detailed each step of his crimes, the evidence collected, and the meticulous way he attempted to conceal his actions. Psychologists testified about his mental state, explaining how his personality disorders, psychopathy, and compulsive behaviors combined to make him an effective predator. Leonard Fraser was ultimately convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The impact of his crimes extended far beyond the court. Families of victims faced unimaginable grief and trauma. Communities grappled with fear, distrust, and the realization that danger could come from someone who appeared ordinary. Melbourne learned harsh lessons about vulnerability, protection, and the importance of awareness. Even decades later, Leonard Fraser's case remains a critical study in criminology and psychology. His ability to exploit vulnerability, mask his behavior, and commit repeated violent acts provides insight into human behavior, predation, and the consequences of societal neglect. His story is a reminder that appearances can deceive, that ordinary individuals can harbor extraordinary darkness, and that vigilance and understanding are necessary to protect the vulnerable. The city eventually recovered from the terror he instilled, but Leonard Fraser's legacy as a predator continues to be studied. His life, crimes, and the aftermath serve as a haunting case study in the psychology of serial predation, community fear, and the long-lasting impact of violence on society. Every detail of his actions, from careful planning to final arrest, underscores how predatory behavior can persist in plain sight, hidden beneath a facade of ordinariness. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a man whose crimes turned the city of Hanover, Germany, into a place of fear and horror. A man whose outward charm and apparent normalcy hid a mind consumed by violence and desire for control. His name was Fritz. This story is about his life, his victims, his crimes, the terror he caused, the investigation that hunted him down, and the legacy he left behind. Fritz Harman was born in October 1879 in Hanover, Germany. His early childhood was marked by instability, neglect, and exposure to violence. His father was strict and authoritarian, often punishing Fritz harshly for minor infractions. His mother struggled to manage the household under economic pressures and frequently showed little warmth. From a young age, Fritz displayed unusual behaviors: fascination with death, obsession with power and control, and violent tendencies. Teachers and neighbors noted that he could be polite and charming, but he also exhibited sudden aggression and a disturbing curiosity about corpses and suffering. As a teenager, Fritz drifted between schools and jobs. He struggled to maintain steady employment and often found himself in trouble with the law for petty theft and minor assaults. During this time, he developed patterns of social manipulation, charm, and dominance, skills he would later use to lure victims. He also began to experience sexual desires entwined with aggression, showing an early tendency toward predatory behavior, particularly toward young men who were isolated or vulnerable. By his 20s, Fritz lived a life that seemed ordinary to outsiders. He worked in small businesses, socialized with acquaintances, and cultivated a reputation as a helpful and intelligent young man. However, beneath the surface, he was drawn to violence and murder. His first known killings occurred around 1918, when he began targeting young male vagrants and runaways in Hanover. Fritz had an extraordinary ability to identify vulnerable individuals, boys and young men who were alone, without strong family support, or in desperate circumstances. Fritz's method was chilling and consistent. He would approach victims in public spaces, streets, train stations, or workplaces, offering them friendship, employment, or shelter. He gained their trust, often using charm and a friendly demeanor, then lured them to private locations where he could commit murder. His preferred method was biting through the throat, an act both brutal and efficient. After killing, he would often dismember the bodies and dispose of the remains in the Lane River, sometimes burning parts of the body or hiding them in his home. He even sold some of the flesh from victims, a fact that earned him the grim nickname, the Butcher of Hanover. Victims were numerous. While exact numbers remain uncertain, authorities confirmed at least 24 murders, though estimates suggest he may have killed more than 50 young men. Each victim had a similar story: lonely, vulnerable, and approached by Fritz under the pretense of help. Among them were young laborers, apprentices, and runaways. Investigators later documented their last known movements, piecing together a timeline of Fritz's predatory behavior. Each killing reflected a combination of impulsivity, sexual compulsion, and a calculated understanding of how to avoid suspicion. The city of Hanover, already struggling after World War I with poverty and social disruption, was an environment Fritz exploited with terrifying precision. Homeless and displaced young men were easy targets, and the chaos of post-war life delayed detection. Residents began to notice disappearances, but the connections were not immediately apparent. The fear in the community grew slowly as families reported missing sons, brothers, and nephews, and rumors of a predator circulated quietly at first. Police investigations intensified in the early 1920s as patterns emerged. Authorities noticed that missing young men had last been seen near areas where Fritz frequently operated. Surveillance and questioning of neighbors, acquaintances, and coworkers began to paint a picture of a man with a troubling presence and suspicious behavior. Forensic examination of discovered remains revealed dismemberment and signs of deliberate concealment, indicating a murderer with anatomical knowledge and methodical planning. In 1924, Fritz Harman was finally apprehended after one of his intended victims escaped and reported him. During interrogation, Fritz initially denied the murders but soon confessed, calmly recounting his steps, his methods, and the reasons he targeted specific victims. Psychologists later evaluated him and concluded that he displayed classic psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, manipulativeness, sexual sadism, and an obsessive desire for control. The trial of Fritz Harman captivated Germany. Courtrooms were packed, and the public followed each revelation with horror. Witnesses testified about how he lured victims, manipulated friends and acquaintances, and maintained a seemingly ordinary social life. Forensic experts presented evidence of the dismembered bodies, the disposal methods, and the traces of human flesh found in locations connected to him. Psychologists described the unusual combination of sexual compulsion and predatory intelligence that allowed him to operate undetected for years. Fritz was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. He was executed by guillotine in 1925. The public was both horrified and fascinated, as the case illustrated how easily someone with charm and intelligence could hide a monstrous inner life. Families of victims struggled with grief and the knowledge that a predator had systematically targeted their loved ones. Communities in Hanover remembered the fear that gripped the city, a fear made worse by the ordinary appearance of the killer. Fritz Harman's legacy is one of extreme cautionary tale and psychological study. Criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement continue to examine his methods, his manipulations, and his ability to exploit vulnerability. His case demonstrates how societal instability, charm, and intelligence can be combined with psychopathy to devastating effect. Even decades later, his story is taught as an example of how evil can hide behind ordinary faces, how the most terrifying crimes often occur where least expected, and how human nature can harbor profound darkness beneath seemingly normal exteriors. The city of Hanover eventually recovered from the terror he caused, but the memory of Fritz Harman remained ingrained in public consciousness. His life, crimes, and the aftermath are a chilling reminder that monsters can live among us unnoticed, that appearances can deceive, and that the study of human behavior is essential to prevent such horrors in the future. His story continues to haunt historians, criminologists, and all who examine the chilling intersection of normalcy and evil. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a man who convinced the world that he was reformed, a man who stood on stages and wrote books about redemption, all while secretly continuing the very crimes he swore he had left behind. This is the story of Jack Unterweger, a killer who lived a double life so convincingly that he fooled judges, journalists, and entire nations. His tale is one of charm wrapped around horror, of a society desperate to believe in rehabilitation while being blind to the darkness still alive inside him. Jack Unterweger was born in August 1950 in Judenburg, a small town in Austria. His beginnings were marked by instability and neglect. His mother was a barmaid and a sex worker who abandoned him when he was still young. His father was an American soldier who disappeared from his life entirely. Jack spent his early years in the care of his grandfather, a man with a violent streak who was known for drunken rages and cruelty. In this fractured environment, Jack grew up with no sense of stability, no parental guidance, and a distorted idea of love and discipline. By his teenage years, Jack was already on a destructive path. He began with petty crimes like theft and assault, and soon escalated into more serious offenses. His adolescence was defined by a string of arrests and short stints in juvenile facilities. He was quick to anger, reckless, and manipulative. Yet, he also developed a sharp intelligence and a talent for storytelling. He had a charisma that drew people in, even when his behavior was violent and erratic. The first turning point in his life came in 1974. By then, Jack had grown into a man consumed by frustration, rejection, and dark urges. That year, he murdered an 18-year-old woman named Margaret Schaefer. Jack strangled her with her own bra, a method that revealed not just brutality, but also a deeply twisted sexual compulsion. He was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life in prison. For many, this should have been the end of his story. But in prison, Jack began constructing a second life, one that would make him famous and open doors no one thought possible. Behind bars, Jack reinvented himself as a writer. He produced plays, short stories, poems, and even an autobiography that depicted his life of crime and suffering. His work was raw and emotional, filled with reflections on guilt, pain, and the desire for redemption. Intellectuals and artists in Austria began to notice him. Critics praised his talent, claiming he was a voice of authenticity from within the prison walls. Over the years, Jack built a reputation as a man transformed, someone who had shed his violent past and embraced the power of art to heal. By the 1980s, he had gained the support of prominent Austrian figures, including writers, journalists, and politicians. They campaigned for his release, believing he was an example of rehabilitation. They argued that prison had reformed him, that he was no longer a danger to society. After serving about 15 years, Jack Unterweger was released in 1990. The justice system, swayed by the pressure of public opinion and the seeming proof of his talent, gave him freedom. The world outside welcomed him with open arms. He quickly became a minor celebrity in Austria, a symbol of second chances. He was invited to speak at events, to appear on television, and to write for newspapers. He began working as a journalist, covering stories about crime and even about sex workers. To the public, he was a remarkable story of redemption. To those who knew nothing of his inner darkness, he seemed like a success. But Jack's release was not the beginning of a new life. It was the continuation of his old one. Within months of walking free, women began to die again. In 1990, a sex worker in Vienna was found murdered. She had been strangled with her own bra. Soon after, others followed. The killings spread across Austria, Germany, and even to the United States. Each time, the victims were sex workers. Each time, the method was the same. Jack's compulsions had not disappeared during his years in prison. They had only waited. What made his crimes even more horrifying was the way he used his public image to hide in plain sight. He reported on murders that he himself had committed. He wrote about the dangers faced by sex workers while secretly preying on them. He traveled internationally under the guise of journalism, committing murders abroad while gathering information for his articles. His position as a respected writer gave him access and cover that most killers could never dream of. Investigators began to notice the pattern. They realized that Jack had been present in the cities where murders occurred. The killings bore his unmistakable signature. In 1992, the pressure mounted. Austrian police finally gathered enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant. Jack fled the country, moving through several nations before ending up in the United States. But the law had caught up to him. In Miami, he was arrested and extradited back to Austria. His trial was one of the most sensational in Austrian history. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers. The same man who had once been celebrated as a reformed writer now stood accused of multiple murders. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the undeniable pattern of his killings. Jack, however, maintained his charm. He denied his guilt, often smiling and engaging with the media as if he were still the star of a story rather than its villain. In 1994, the jury found him guilty of 9 murders, though investigators suspected he was responsible for many more. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For a man who had once escaped prison through charm and words, there would be no escape this time. But even in the end, Jack Unterweger maintained control of his own story. On the night of his conviction, he tied a rope made from the cord of his trousers and hanged himself in his prison cell. His method was chillingly symbolic. He had used the strangulation of women as his signature crime. In death, he strangled himself. It was as though he had written the final chapter of his story in the same language of violence that had defined his life. The tale of Jack Unterweger remains one of the most disturbing reminders of how appearances can deceive. He was not just a murderer, but a manipulator of entire systems. He convinced intellectuals, politicians, and society itself that he was reformed, while never abandoning his compulsions. His case forced people to reconsider the idea of redemption and the ease with which charm can hide evil. Jack Unterweger's legacy is not one of literature or redemption. It is one of betrayal, of trust broken, and of lives destroyed. Behind his words and his public persona was a predator who never stopped hunting. His story serves as a warning that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who wear the mask of humanity most convincingly. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of a woman whose crimes were so horrifying that they shocked an entire nation. A woman whose ordinary appearance hid a mind consumed by superstition, manipulation, and murder. Her name was Leonarda. This is the story of how fear, obsession, and a twisted sense of destiny led her to commit acts that no one could imagine, turning innocent women into victims in the most gruesome way. Leonarda Cianciulli was born in April 1894 in Montella, a small town in southern Italy. Her early life was marked by tragedy, superstition, and hardship. Her family was poor, and she witnessed suffering and death from a young age. Her mother, like many in the region, relied on local folklore, superstitions, and religious rituals to make sense of the world. Leonarda absorbed these beliefs, developing a mindset in which unseen forces, omens, and fate played a central role in every decision. As a child, Leonarda showed signs of intelligence and curiosity, but also volatility. She was highly emotional and easily influenced by the superstitions and beliefs of those around her. Her early experiences with poverty and death seemed to instill in her a need to control her environment and to believe that certain rituals or sacrifices could protect her family from misfortune. She attended school irregularly and spent much of her childhood helping her family with domestic work, all the while forming ideas about luck, destiny, and the power of ritual. In 1917, Leonarda married Michel Cianciulli, a man she met in her village. The marriage was complex. Michel was hardworking but often away, and Leonarda's obsession with protecting her family intensified during these years. She gave birth to 3 children, but tragedy struck repeatedly. Miscarriages, infant deaths, and illnesses reinforced her fear that dark forces were controlling her life. She began consulting fortune tellers, astrologers, and reading superstitious texts, all in an attempt to gain control over her fate. By the late 1930s, Leonarda had moved to Correggio in northern Italy. She lived a life that appeared ordinary to her neighbors, a mother, a wife, and a woman managing household affairs. Yet beneath the surface, her mind was increasingly obsessed with magic, omens, and the idea that human sacrifice could prevent misfortune. She believed that the deaths of others could protect her family from tragedy, and that certain rituals could manipulate fate itself. Leonarda's first known murder occurred in 1939. She selected women from her social circle, those who trusted her or sought her advice. She lured them under the guise of friendship, work, or charity, gaining their confidence. Once they were in her home, she killed them, often by strangulation or other means that allowed her to maintain control without attracting attention. The act itself was ritualistic. She believed that by killing and processing her victims, she could transfer their life force into protective energy for her family. What made Leonarda's crimes particularly horrific was what she did afterward. She transformed the bodies of her victims into everyday objects. Soap, tea cakes, and other household items were made from human fat. She served these items to neighbors, friends, or even her own family, convinced that this would protect them from illness, misfortune, or death. To outsiders, this was invisible, ordinary domestic work, cooking, and preparation of goods, but it hid unspeakable horror within. Her murders were methodical and planned. She selected victims carefully, often women who trusted her, and maintained an appearance of ordinary domestic life. The fear in the community was subtle at first. Missing women whispered rumors, but investigators slowly began to notice patterns. The disappearances were linked to Leonarda's home, her relationships, and her circle of acquaintances. In 1940, suspicion finally reached authorities. Investigators were drawn to Leonarda after missing persons reports, unusual patterns in her household, and statement from acquaintances who had observed her behavior. Forensic examination, interviews, and careful detective work revealed the unimaginable truth. They discovered remains, traces of human fat processed into soap, and evidence of her ritualistic practices. The community was horrified. A woman who appeared ordinary, calm, and domestic had committed multiple murders in the service of superstition and obsession. Leonarda was arrested and brought to trial in 1946. The courtroom was filled with astonishment and revulsion. She confessed to her crimes without hesitation, often calmly explaining her rationale, that she had acted to protect her family, to prevent misfortune, and to obey what she believed were mystical forces beyond human comprehension. Psychologists later examined her and noted a complex mix of obsessive-compulsive traits, superstition-driven psychosis, and extreme narcissism. The trial was one of the most sensational in Italy at the time. Leonarda's ability to articulate her beliefs, her calm demeanor, and her unapologetic explanation of her actions shocked the public. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence reflecting both the gravity of her crimes and her unusual mental state. In prison, she reportedly continued to discuss superstitions, rituals, and protective magic, remaining consistent with the worldview that had motivated her murders. Leonarda Cianciulli's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of ritualistic murder in modern history. Her story is studied for its psychological complexity, her ability to blend ordinary domestic life with extraordinary horror, and the way superstition and obsession can twist human morality. She took lives under the belief that she was protecting those she loved, but in doing so she committed acts of unimaginable cruelty. Even decades later, the story of the soap maker of Correggio is taught in criminology, psychology, and forensic studies. It serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary appearances, that belief and obsession can drive humans to unspeakable acts, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those who are the mask of domestic normalcy. Her crimes, her methods, and her psychology continue to haunt the study of human behavior, leaving an indelible mark on history. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who lived two lives. To the public, he was handsome, charming, and even won a spot on a national television dating show. But in secret, he was a predator who stalked, tortured, and killed with a cruelty that is almost impossible to comprehend. His name was Rodney Alcala, and he would become known as the dating game killer. Rodney James Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. From the beginning, his life was marked by instability. His father left the family when Rodney was very young, creating a household of tension and uncertainty. His mother moved the family to Los Angeles, seeking a safer environment and better opportunities. Rodney showed intelligence early on. He was imaginative, creative, and even talented in schoolwork, but he also displayed troubling signs: emotional detachment, manipulativeness, and an unusual fascination with power and control. Teachers often praised his intellect, but noted his inability to form friendships or empathize with his peers. During his teenage years, Alcala became increasingly withdrawn. He showed obsessive tendencies, compulsive routines, and a growing fascination with violent media. He struggled with social relationships and often viewed others as objects rather than people. By the time he reached adolescence, he had already begun forming fantasies of domination and control over others, especially women and children. These early psychological patterns would eventually evolve into lethal behavior. In 1960, Alcala joined the United States Army, serving as a clerk. He was not suited for military life. He experienced a psychological breakdown and was diagnosed with antisocial personality traits. His service ended prematurely in 1964, but the experience seemed only to deepen his detachment from society. After leaving the Army, he enrolled at UCLA, studying film and photography. Photography became more than a hobby. It was a tool for manipulation, a way to document and control his victims. Alcala often used his charm and appearance to win trust while planning his predatory acts. By the late 1960s, Alcala's criminal behavior escalated. In 1968, he lured an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood apartment. She was sexually assaulted, but she survived, thanks to a witness who alerted authorities. Alcala fled before police could apprehend him. This attack demonstrated both his violent tendencies and his ability to evade capture. Over the next several years, Alcala became increasingly mobile, moving across cities and states. He used his intelligence, charm, and superficial charisma to appear harmless. He targeted young women and girls, often approaching them in public places or posing as a photographer, filmmaker, or tutor. He would carefully study his victims, gain their trust, and lure them into isolated locations. Once alone, he restrained them, sexually assaulted them, and in many cases murdered them. Alcala photographed his victims before and after the attacks, using the images to relive and maintain control over his crimes. One of the most chilling aspects of Alcala's crimes was the contrast between his public persona and his hidden violence. In 1978, he appeared on the popular television show The Dating Game. Millions watched him smile, flirt, and charm contestants, completely unaware that he had already committed multiple murders. He was able to maintain this double life because of his intelligence, meticulous planning, and the superficial trust he inspired in others. The juxtaposition of his normalcy on television and the horrors he committed privately heightened the terror once the truth emerged. The pattern of Alcala's murders was methodical. He often chose victims who were marginalized, vulnerable, or in situations where they would not be immediately missed. He photographed them obsessively, keeping evidence that would later be used against him. His crimes were spread across multiple states, which made it difficult for law enforcement to connect the cases initially. Investigators faced the challenge of piecing together disappearances and murders that spanned years and locations, often with limited cooperation from witnesses or family members who had little information about their missing loved ones. Alcala's arrest came in the late 1970s after police began to identify a pattern linking several missing women and recovered evidence from crime scenes. When authorities finally apprehended him, they discovered extensive photographic material, personal items from victims, and other evidence showing a systematic and deliberate pattern of sexual assault and murder. The scope of his crimes revealed decades of terror inflicted on innocent people who had crossed his path. During his trials, Alcala's intelligence and manipulativeness became apparent. He attempted to represent himself at times, using charm and legal knowledge to influence proceedings. Psychologists testified that he had psychopathic traits, including superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and sadistic tendencies. His ability to evade suspicion for so long, combined with his normal appearance and articulate manner, made him a particularly dangerous and horrifying criminal. Alcala was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. Investigators later tied him to additional victims through DNA evidence, photographs, and witness testimony. The public was horrified not only by the scale of his crimes, but also by his ability to appear on television and live a seemingly normal life while committing acts of unspeakable violence in secret. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of a serial killer who combined intelligence, charm, and extreme psychopathy to evade capture for decades. The psychological and social impact of Alcala's crimes was profound. Families of victims endured unimaginable grief. Communities were shaken by fear, and law enforcement learned critical lessons about patterns of mobility, charm, and predatory behavior in serial killers. Alcala's life continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals as an example of how deeply manipulative and intelligent predators can operate unnoticed for years, and how appearances can be dangerously deceiving. Rodney Alcala died in 2021. His crimes left behind an enduring legacy of fear and a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist behind a charming smile. His victims and their families carry the scars of his actions, and his life story serves as a case study in the terrifying combination of intelligence, charm, and psychopathy. Alcala's case will remain one of the most chilling chapters in American criminal history, a story that is difficult to comprehend fully but impossible to forget. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who moved like a ghost across borders, leaving terror and death in his wake. To many, he seemed ordinary, even quiet at times, but beneath the surface he was a predator whose crimes were ruthless, impulsive, and devastating. His actions stretched across states and countries, and for years, he eluded capture while leaving communities in fear. His name was Angel. Angel was born in 1959 in Irapuato, Guanajuato, Mexico. His early life was defined by poverty and hardship. He was the eldest of several children in a household where basic needs were often unmet. From a very young age, Angel witnessed and experienced neglect and violence, which shaped his perception of the world. He learned that strength and intimidation could command attention, and that fear could be a tool for survival. These lessons, ingrained in early childhood, would later become central to his crimes. As a child, Angel displayed troubling behaviors. He was often aggressive toward peers and sometimes adults, lashing out in ways that were disproportionate to circumstance. He struggled to form friendships, preferring solitude or controlling playmates through intimidation. Teachers noted his intelligence, but also his inability to empathize and his fascination with dominance. He began to fantasize about power, imagining scenarios in which he could control others completely. These fantasies were not mere daydreams. They became blueprints for later crimes. During adolescence, Angel's life was unsettled. He left school early and began drifting between odd jobs, often labor-intensive work in fields, factories, or construction. This period of mobility allowed him to experience freedom from oversight and reinforced his pattern of avoidance and secrecy. He began committing small acts of theft and assault, learning to navigate the consequences of his actions while remaining under the radar. The combination of intelligence, adaptability, and impulsive aggression made him increasingly dangerous. By the 1980s, Angel's criminal activity escalated. He began targeting vulnerable individuals, primarily women who were alone or living on society's margins. His first known murders were opportunistic, taking advantage of situations where he could isolate victims without immediate detection. Angel's mobility played a crucial role in his ability to evade law enforcement. He traveled frequently, often using the railway system to move between cities and states, making it difficult to trace his actions or link his crimes. Angel became known as the Railroad Killer because many of his murders occurred near railways or locations associated with trains. He used his intimate knowledge of these transit systems to plan movements, select victims, and escape after committing crimes. Each attack followed a pattern. He would gain the victim's trust through charm, promises of work, or casual friendliness, then isolate and assault them. Many victims were strangled, stabbed, or shot, often in secluded areas where discovery was delayed. Angel's ability to appear ordinary while committing violent acts made him terrifying to both victims and investigators. Communities where Angel struck were left in fear and confusion. Families of victims were often unaware of the danger until it was too late. Local authorities struggled to connect the disappearances, as victims were spread across multiple jurisdictions. The fragmented nature of the crimes, combined with Angel's strategic mobility, allowed him to operate for years without being caught. Each murder left psychological scars that extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating ripple effects of fear and suspicion in neighborhoods and towns. Law enforcement eventually began piecing together the pattern of murders. Investigators noticed the geographical clustering of bodies, similarities in victim profiles, and the unusual locations where bodies were found. Witness reports occasionally described a man who offered rides or work before the victims disappeared, and forensic evidence began to connect multiple crime scenes. Angel's intelligence and cunning made him difficult to apprehend, but advancements in investigative techniques, including DNA analysis and coordinated multi-jurisdictional efforts, eventually led to his identification. Angel was arrested after a combination of forensic breakthroughs and witness cooperation. Authorities discovered evidence linking him to more than 15 known murders, with suspicions of additional unconfirmed victims. During interrogation, Angel displayed a mixture of calm detachment and calculated manipulation. Psychologists later analyzed his behavior, highlighting traits of psychopathy, lack of remorse, sadistic tendencies, impulsivity, and the ability to charm or deceive those around him. His crimes were both premeditated and opportunistic, demonstrating a deep understanding of human behavior and vulnerability. During his trial, the chilling extent of Angel's actions became public. Families of victims recounted the devastating impact of his crimes, describing fear, grief, and the enduring trauma caused by his actions. Communities reflected on the horror of a man who had operated for years largely unnoticed, exploiting both societal blind spots and individual vulnerabilities. Legal experts emphasize the challenges of prosecuting crimes spread across multiple states and international borders, noting the complexity of coordination between agencies and the difficulties in gathering consistent evidence. Angel was eventually sentenced to death. His execution took place in Texas, closing the legal chapter but leaving the emotional and psychological consequences unresolved for many families. Law enforcement agencies and criminal psychologists continue to study his life and crimes, analyzing the intersection of mobility, opportunity, and psychopathy. Angel's story is a case study in how intelligence, ruthlessness, and the ability to blend into society can allow a serial killer to operate undetected for years, causing fear and devastation across vast areas. The legacy of Angel's crimes is multifaceted. Beyond the horror of his murders, his actions highlighted systemic challenges in policing mobile offenders, the vulnerability of marginalized populations, and the importance of interagency cooperation in solving serial crimes. His victims' families continue to bear the psychological and emotional scars of his predation, and communities remember the fear he instilled. Angel's story serves as a stark reminder that appearances can deceive and that a quiet, ordinary-looking person can harbor a darkness capable of extraordinary destruction. Even decades after his death, Angel remains a symbol of the dangers of unchecked psychopathy, mobility, and opportunity. He teaches lessons about vigilance, the necessity of effective investigation techniques, and the consequences of ignoring early warning signs in human behavior. His story is not just a record of crimes. It is a cautionary tale, a narrative that illustrates how one man's obsessions, intelligence, and lack of empathy can terrorize entire regions for years, leaving a legacy that is impossible to forget. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man whose actions would shock a nation and haunt the memory of his family forever. To the outside world, he appeared as an ordinary man, a father, a husband, someone who blended into his community. But behind this facade lay a violent, controlling, and dangerous individual who would commit acts so brutal that they would leave an enduring scar on the lives of those around him. His name was Yasser. Yasser was born in 1957 in Egypt. He grew up in a conservative household where strict rules and harsh discipline were a daily part of life. As a child, he was expected to obey authority without question, and he internalized a rigid sense of control and obedience. Early experiences with family discipline and cultural expectations shaped his worldview, emphasizing respect, honor, and reputation above personal freedom or individual choice. These lessons would later form the framework for his violent control over his own family. As a young man, Yasser moved to the United States, seeking better opportunities. He settled in Texas and began a family. At first glance, he appeared devoted and responsible, working to provide for his wife and children. But his personality was marked by a need for control, a strict interpretation of honor, and a willingness to use violence to enforce obedience. Friends and neighbors sometimes described him as strict, authoritarian, and temperamental, though few could imagine the extremity of his actions to come. Yasser's daughters grew up under this environment. The two girls, ages 17 and 18 in 2008, were bright, social, and eager to engage with the world outside their father's strict household. They attended school, made friends, and began asserting their independence. For Yasser, this independence was seen as defiance, a challenge to his authority, and, in his mind, a stain on the family's honor. He could not tolerate what he viewed as disobedience or embarrassment, and he began to harbor thoughts of punishment that would ultimately turn lethal. On a tragic day in January 2008, Yasser carried out a plan that would shock the nation. In a calculated act, he lured both of his daughters to a location under false pretenses. Once they were together, he murdered them both with a firearm. The killings were deliberate, precise, and carried out in cold blood. In the aftermath, Yasser fled, leaving a community and a family devastated. The daughter's mother, extended family, and neighbors were left in disbelief, struggling to understand how a father could commit such an act. The investigation into the murders was immediate and extensive. Law enforcement quickly identified Yasser as the primary suspect. Witnesses described him and reported his suspicious behavior in the days leading up to the killings. Investigators pieced together evidence, including phone records, family testimonies, and patterns of control and threats that Yasser had exhibited over years. It became clear that the murders were premeditated, rooted in his rigid sense of honor and obsession with control over his daughters. For years, Yasser remained on the run. He evaded capture by moving frequently, using safe houses, and relying on networks of friends and family who sometimes aided him, either knowingly or unknowingly. His ability to avoid detection demonstrated both his careful planning and his adaptability. Despite national attention, law enforcement faced challenges in apprehending him due to his mobility, knowledge of local systems, and the fear he inspired in those who might report his whereabouts. During his time as a fugitive, Yasser became one of the most wanted men in the country. Federal and state agencies collaborated to track him, using tips, surveillance, and investigative techniques to narrow down his location. His case highlighted the complexities of tracking a fugitive with familial and cultural networks, as well as the difficulties in coordinating across jurisdictions. Communities across Texas and beyond followed news updates with anxiety, fearing that a man capable of killing his own children could remain at large indefinitely. Eventually, Yasser was captured in 2020 after more than a decade on the run. Authorities were able to apprehend him through a combination of investigative persistence, tip-offs, and careful planning. He was taken into custody without incident, ending years of uncertainty and fear. During his arrest and subsequent legal proceedings, the horror of his actions was fully documented. Investigators and prosecutors presented a case that showed not only the killings themselves, but also the psychological control, manipulation, and planning that led to the murders. In court, Yasser's behavior, personality, and motives were analyzed in depth. Experts testified about his controlling nature, his rigid interpretation of honor, and his complete lack of empathy for his daughters. Psychologists highlighted how his upbringing, combined with personal temperament, had created a man willing to commit murder to enforce his authority. The trial revealed the chilling reality that the murders were not impulsive or accidental, but deliberate acts motivated by a desire to maintain control at any cost. Yasser was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The families of the victims expressed a mixture of grief, relief, and continuing sorrow. The wider community reflected on the case as an example of the dangers of extreme control and obsession, the vulnerability of young people under authoritarian authority figures, and the importance of vigilance in protecting those at risk. The legacy of Yasser's crimes is complex. His actions highlighted cultural, familial, and psychological dynamics that can, in rare cases, escalate to extreme violence. Law enforcement and social services learned lessons about monitoring patterns of abuse, recognizing threats within households, and coordinating efforts to protect potential victims. Families affected by the murders continue to navigate grief and trauma, but the resolution of his capture and conviction offered a measure of justice and closure. Even decades later, Yasser's story serves as a chilling reminder of how control, obsession, and rigid interpretation of honor can turn a parent into a killer. His daughters' lives were cut tragically short, and their loss reverberates through communities, legal systems, and families. For students of criminal behavior, psychology, and law enforcement, the case provides insight into the intersection of domestic violence, cultural pressures, and premeditated murder. It is a story of terror, planning, and human tragedy, one that forces reflection on the darkest aspects of familial control and the devastating consequences that can result when fear and authority are taken to deadly extremes. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man whose darkness stretched over decades. To the outside world, he seemed ordinary, even quiet at times, but beneath the surface he was a predator who would commit unimaginable acts of violence. His actions left fear, grief, and horror in every place he touched, and the scale of his crimes spanned years, leaving investigators struggling to understand how someone so seemingly normal could carry out such horrors. David Edward was born in 1957 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. From the beginning, his life was shaped by neglect, instability, and exposure to violence. His father was absent for much of his early childhood, and his mother struggled to care for her family under difficult circumstances. David grew up in a household where punishment was harsh and affection was rare. He learned early that the world could be cruel, and he internalized a sense of fear, anger, and detachment that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even as a child, David exhibited troubling behaviors. He had difficulty forming relationships with peers and showed aggression when frustrated or challenged. He began to develop an obsession with control and dominance, fascinated with how people could be manipulated and often tested limits in ways that alarmed adults. He had periods of intense focus, particularly when it came to understanding how people reacted to fear or authority. Teachers noted his intelligence, but also his inability to empathize, his fascination with cruelty, and the unpredictable swings between charm and aggression. During adolescence, these behaviors intensified. David began engaging in acts of cruelty toward animals and small acts of vandalism that revealed a deeper fascination with power over living beings. He spent long hours alone, reading, planning, and fantasizing about control and retribution. Socially, he became increasingly isolated, while simultaneously displaying the ability to charm adults and peers when it suited him. This combination of detachment, intelligence, and manipulativeness foreshadowed the calculated predation that would later define his life. As he entered adulthood, David's life remained unstable. He drifted through various jobs and cities, never forming lasting social bonds or stable employment. He committed crimes in secret, often preying on vulnerable individuals who had little protection or support. Over time, his behaviors escalated in both severity and frequency. His pattern was methodical. He studied victims carefully, learned their routines, and then used charm, coercion, or intimidation to isolate them. Once alone, he carried out sexual assaults and murders, often leaving evidence that later helped investigators connect him to multiple crimes. The terror David created extended far beyond the victims themselves. Communities where he operated were left in fear and confusion. Parents worried about their children. Neighbors reported suspicious behavior, and local authorities struggled to understand the seemingly random disappearances. He was able to maintain a facade of normalcy, blending into towns and neighborhoods, which allowed him to commit crimes over decades without drawing immediate suspicion. His calm exterior concealed an individual driven by obsession, compulsion, and psychopathy. Investigators faced a unique challenge in connecting David to his crimes. His offenses were spread across different states and years, making patterns difficult to detect. In each location, he adapted his methods to minimize risk, taking care to avoid leaving obvious evidence while still fulfilling the compulsions driving him. Physical evidence, witness testimonies, and victim patterns eventually formed a mosaic that led law enforcement to see the scope of his actions. When David was finally arrested, the investigation revealed the horrifying scale of his crimes. Law enforcement recovered physical evidence linking him to multiple murders, as well as personal items that belonged to victims. In the courtroom, experts described his psychopathy, a complete lack of empathy, deep-seated manipulative tendencies, and compulsive sexual and violent behavior. David often remained calm during proceedings, sometimes attempting to charm those around him or manipulate trial dynamics. His intelligence and social awareness had allowed him to evade detection for decades, which only added to the chilling nature of his crimes. The impact on the families of his victims was profound. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and children were left with trauma that would never fully heal. Communities struggled with grief and fear, often unable to understand how someone so ordinary-looking could commit such horrors. The legacy of his actions extended beyond the immediate crimes, prompting changes in law enforcement procedures, interstate communication, and approaches to identifying serial offenders. Psychologists later analyzed David's life and crimes in depth. His childhood neglect, exposure to violence, early signs of cruelty, and obsessive desire for control were all factors that contributed to his violent development. Experts noted how he combined charm, intelligence, and psychopathy to carry out his acts undetected, demonstrating a rare and terrifying capacity for premeditation and deception. His life serves as a case study in how early trauma and unchecked violent impulses can evolve into decades of predatory behavior, leaving destruction and fear in their wake. David died in prison, leaving behind the indelible mark of his crimes. His victims' families continued to cope with the aftermath, and investigators reflected on the lessons learned from his long criminal career. The story of David remains a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances, and how a single individual, driven by obsession and psychopathy, can leave a trail of terror that spans decades. His life story is not only a record of violence, but a warning that early warning signs, untreated psychological issues, and unchecked compulsions can, in some cases, lead to extreme outcomes. The calm, ordinary face he presented to the world masked a terrifying reality that only gradually came to light. And for those who study criminal psychology, law enforcement, and human behavior, David's story continues to serve as one of the most haunting examples of how ordinary-looking people can commit extraordinary acts of evil. Next story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who lived an ordinary life on the surface, but hid a darkness so profound that it would terrorize an entire city for years. To neighbors, co-workers, and even friends, he appeared calm, reliable, and friendly. But behind this facade was a man whose mind was consumed by violence, manipulation, and control. His name was Dean. Dean was born in 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. From the very beginning, his life was marked by instability. His family struggled with strict discipline, emotional neglect, and volatile dynamics. Dean was the eldest child, and he learned early that power and control could dictate outcomes. He experienced a mixture of punishment and inconsistency, and these formative experiences shaped a worldview where dominance and fear became tools to navigate life. As a child, Dean exhibited troubling behavior. He often lashed out at peers, displayed aggression disproportionate to circumstances, and began showing signs of cruelty toward animals. Teachers described him as intelligent but socially awkward, capable of charm and politeness in some situations, yet unpredictable and volatile in others. By adolescence, Dean's obsessions had shifted toward control and the study of fear. He was fascinated by the reactions of others, imagining ways to manipulate, dominate, and harm. Dean's early adult life in Houston, Texas, appeared normal. He worked in small businesses, sold goods, and maintained a clean, polite public image. Neighbors and acquaintances found him friendly and trustworthy. But beneath the surface, Dean's mind was preoccupied with predatory fantasies. He began targeting vulnerable boys and young men, carefully observing and selecting those who were isolated, naive, or in need of work and guidance. He learned how to gain trust quickly, offering rides, jobs, or friendship, only to exploit that trust to lure them to private locations where he could commit assaults without interruption. Dean's criminal pattern involved both meticulous planning and opportunistic behavior. He often used his teenage accomplices, who he manipulated into helping him, as both enforcers and witnesses. These accomplices were drawn into his orbit through psychological control, threats, and the illusion of loyalty. Dean understood the power of fear and influence, bending the will of those around him to serve his purposes. Through this network, he was able to expand his predation over several years without immediate detection. Over time, Dean's methods became increasingly audacious. He murdered at least 28 known victims, although some estimates suggest more. Many were buried in secluded areas, including hidden locations on his own properties. Each victim was carefully selected and lured. Some were approached in public spaces, others through acquaintances. He studied their habits, vulnerabilities, and social connections to ensure minimal interference. Each murder was executed with precision, with careful disposal to delay discovery. Communities in Houston gradually became aware that something was wrong as more boys and young men went missing. Families reported disappearances, often delayed by assumptions that the youths had run away or were transient. Local authorities investigated, but without connections between the missing individuals, patterns were difficult to establish. Dean's outward normalcy, combined with the mobility and vulnerability of his victims, allowed him to continue his crimes undetected for years. Law enforcement eventually began piecing together the scale of Dean's atrocities. Investigators noticed clustering in disappearance locations, witness accounts of Dean's interactions with victims, and testimony from his accomplices. They discovered burial sites containing multiple victims, evidence of premeditation, and the chilling psychological control he exercised over his accomplices. Each new revelation compounded the horror, revealing a man capable of calculated, repeated, and systematic violence. Dean's capture occurred in 1973 during a confrontation with one of his accomplices. The accomplice, fearful of Dean's escalating control and aware of the magnitude of the crimes, fatally shot him. This unexpected end led authorities to uncover the full extent of his murders, exposing numerous hidden burial sites, physical evidence, and the accounts of his accomplices. Communities were left in disbelief, realizing that a man they had seen as ordinary had committed years of unimaginable crimes. Psychologists analyzing Dean's behavior described him as an extreme psychopath. He displayed a complete lack of empathy, a compulsive sadistic streak, and an obsession with power and control. His ability to manipulate and dominate both victims and accomplices revealed a rare combination of intelligence and moral detachment. His life and crimes are studied as one of the most disturbing examples of how outward normalcy can mask extraordinary depravity. The impact of Dean's actions was profound. Families were devastated, communities lived in fear, and law enforcement gained critical insight into patterns of serial predation and the vulnerabilities of certain populations. His crimes highlighted the importance of interagency communication, forensic innovation, and early recognition of dangerous behaviors. His actions also underscored the risks faced by marginalized or isolated youths, who were often invisible to authorities. Even decades later, Dean's story continues to haunt Houston. His life and crimes are analyzed in criminology courses, psychological studies, and law enforcement training. Families of victims continue to seek closure, and the city remembers the terror he instilled. Dean Corll's case serves as a chilling reminder of the extremes of human depravity, demonstrating how intelligence, manipulation, and moral detachment can allow a single individual to devastate countless lives over time. Every detail of Dean's life, from his childhood neglect and adolescent obsessions to the methodical execution of his crimes, his manipulation of accomplices, and the painstaking investigation that finally revealed his acts, illustrates the terrifying intersection of intelligence, psychopathy, and opportunity. The legacy of his actions continues to reverberate, serving as both a cautionary tale and a study in the darkest aspects of human behavior. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of Otis Elwood Toole, a man who drifted through life like a shadow, carrying with him the scars of abuse, poverty, and neglect, and leaving behind a trail of horror, unanswered questions, and devastating pain. His life was not one of grand schemes or intricate manipulations, but of chaos, confusion, and violence. He was a killer who confessed and retracted, who blurred the line between truth and lies, who may have taken many lives but left the world never fully certain of what he had actually done. And that uncertainty, that emptiness, is what makes his story one of the most haunting in the history of American true crime. Otis Toole was born on March 5th, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida, into a world that seemed set against him from the start. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when Otis was still a boy, leaving him in the care of a mother who was harsh, cold, and abusive. She dressed him in girls' clothing to humiliate him, beat him, and reminded him constantly that he was unwanted. His grandmother, according to Toole, practiced forms of ritualistic religion that terrified him as a child. He would later claim that she exposed him to occult practices, strange ceremonies, and even encouraged him to take part in rituals that blurred innocence and fear. These claims, like much of what Toole later said in life, are impossible to fully confirm, but they paint the picture of a boy who was never safe, never comforted, and never allowed to feel loved. He was different from the beginning, slow in school, subject to epileptic seizures, and often bullied by other children. He was isolated from his peers. He wandered the streets of Jacksonville, often disappearing for days. Fire fascinated him. He would set small blazes and watch them burn, staring into the flames with a fascination that was both soothing and arousing. Later, psychiatrists would describe him as having pyrophilia, a sexual attraction to fire. By the time he was 10, he was already setting homes and abandoned buildings alight, finding in destruction a twisted sense of control. Sexuality confused and troubled him from an early age. He was molested by older men and admitted to trading sexual acts for money as a teenager. His earliest sexual experiences were marked not by tenderness or choice, but by exploitation and coercion. As he grew older, he began to identify as gay. But in the South of the 1950s and 1960s, this only brought him more isolation, ridicule, and violence. Otis was a boy without belonging, too poor for stability, too strange for acceptance, and too damaged for comfort. His teenage years were marked by drifting, petty crimes, and violence. He would later claim that he killed for the first time as a teenager, stabbing a traveling salesman who had propositioned him. Whether this story is true remains unknown, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of his life. Confessions of murder that could never be proven. Sometimes he told the truth, sometimes he lied, and sometimes he blurred the two until no one could tell the difference. By adulthood, Otis was a drifter moving through the South without direction. He was transient, unstable, and unpredictable. He worked odd jobs, slept in bus stations or abandoned buildings and wander highways. It was during these years of drifting that he met another man who would change the course of his life. Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas, like Toole, was born into neglect and abuse. He, too, had grown up violent, unstable, and alienated. When the two men met in the mid-1970s, they seemed to recognize themselves in each other. They became companions, lovers at times, partners in drifting, and, as they would both later claim, partners in killing. The pair became infamous for their confessions, at one point admitting to hundreds of murders across the country. They painted themselves as nomadic killers, traveling state to state, murdering strangers picked up along the highways, and then moving on without a trace. To hear them tell it, they were among the most prolific killers in history. The problem was that most of those confessions could not be verified. Some are proven false, with Lucas and Toole confessing to murders they could not possibly have committed because they were in another state at the time. Yet, their words were so detailed, so graphic, and so consistent with each other that investigators struggled to separate fact from fiction. For a time, police departments across the country were eager to pin unsolved murders on the duo, closing cases based on confessions that were shaky at best. Later, this rush to believe would be criticized as sloppy police work. But in the moment, Toole and Lucas seemed to provide answers to mysteries that had haunted communities for years. Amid the sea of confessions, however, there were confirmed crimes that showed Toole's capacity for violence. In January 1982, he killed a man named George Sonnenberg by setting fire to his home while Sonnenberg was inside. Toole had been living with Sonnenberg at the time and set the blaze after an argument. Sonnenberg died of his injuries, and Toole was eventually convicted of the murder. He was later convicted of the murder of a 64-year-old woman named Dorothy Burkett, whom he strangled, and another murder in Tallahassee. These convictions proved that, even if many of his confessions were lies or exaggerations, Otis Toole was a killer. But it was one case in particular that forever tied his name to American memory: the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh. On July 27, 1981, 6-year-old Adam Walsh disappeared from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. His mother had left him briefly at a video game display while she shopped, and when she returned, he was gone. 2 weeks later, his severed head was found in a drainage canal more than 100 miles away. The murder shocked the nation. It was brutal, senseless, and left parents across America terrified for their children. Adam's father, John Walsh, would channel his grief into activism, becoming the host of America's Most Wanted and one of the most vocal advocates for missing children's rights in U.S. history. Years later, Otis Toole confessed multiple times to killing Adam Walsh. He said he lured the boy into his car, drove him away, and murdered him. He described details of the crime in a way that seemed convincing. Yet, as always with Toole, the truth was tangled. He later recanted. Then he confessed again. Police discovered that his car at the time matched witness descriptions, and bloodstains found inside were consistent with Adam's. But the investigation was botched. The car was lost. Evidence was mishandled. For decades, the case remained officially unsolved, even as Toole's confessions continued to haunt the Walsh family. Finally, in 2008, long after Toole's death, police declared the case closed, naming him as Adam's killer. John Walsh accepted the conclusion, but with a bitter knowledge that certainty had been denied to him for decades. Otis Toole spent his later years in prison, serving life sentences for his confirmed murders. His health deteriorated. He developed cirrhosis of the liver, contracted AIDS, and grew weaker as the years passed. In 1996, at the age of 49, he died in prison, a man who had lived in chaos and died in obscurity. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man who moved quietly through the streets of Los Angeles for decades, unseen and unnoticed, hiding a darkness that would haunt the city for years. He was not the kind of killer who acted out in public fits of rage, nor was he flamboyant or attention-seeking. He was patient, meticulous, and careful, blending into a bustling metropolis while preying on some of its most vulnerable residents. His story is one of duality: a man who could be a father, a neighbor, a community member, and at the same time a predator whose actions left families shattered, the city fearful, and investigators baffled. It is a story of patience, evil hidden behind ordinariness, and the devastating consequences of societal blind spots. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was born on August 30th, 1952, in Los Angeles, into a city that would both shape him and conceal him. His early life was not easy. He grew up in a working-class household, part of a family navigating the difficulties of urban poverty. From a young age, he displayed traits that would later emerge as troubling: introversion, social withdrawal, and occasional irritability. He struggled in school, often isolated from peers, and found himself drawn to solitary activities that allowed him to escape the world around him. There were no overt signs that he would become a serial killer, but the seeds of his darkness were already present in the combination of early life stressors, exposure to crime in his environment, and a mind that seemed increasingly detached from empathy. As a young man, Franklin lived like many in his community, taking jobs when he could, raising a family, and attempting to maintain a normal life. He married and had children, moving through the ordinary rhythms of adulthood, attending community events, paying bills, and interacting with neighbors who knew him only as a quiet man who did not stand out. He appeared entirely ordinary, the kind of man you would never suspect of harboring a deadly compulsion. Yet while he fulfilled these social roles, he was simultaneously planning, stalking, and killing. The dichotomy between his public persona and private life is one of the most chilling aspects of his story, and it allowed him to commit murders without detection for decades. Franklin's first known murders began in the mid-1980s. He targeted women who were marginalized, many of whom were involved in sex work, struggled with addiction, or lived in neighborhoods where law enforcement attention was minimal. He would identify these women, follow their routines, and strike when they were isolated. His methods were simple yet terrifyingly effective. He relied on physical control, often using binding or strangulation to overpower his victims. Bodies were disposed of in alleys, vacant lots, dumpsters, and abandoned properties, sometimes left visible to send a chilling message, other times hidden to delay discovery. Investigators at the time did not immediately connect these killings. The women came from neighborhoods that were underpoliced, their disappearances often seen as part of a larger social problem rather than a targeted pattern of murder. The early victims' deaths were cataloged as individual homicides, and the full scale of Franklin's crimes remained invisible. To the families of the victims, the loss was incomprehensible. They were left navigating grief, uncertainty, and the frustration of unanswered questions. For Franklin, the invisibility was protective. His careful blending into the social fabric of Los Angeles allowed him to continue killing without fear of exposure. By the late 1980s, Franklin had gained experience in his methods. His killing became routine in a way that was chillingly methodical. He would identify vulnerable women, gain their trust, lure them to his home or another secluded location, and kill them with minimal noise or resistance. Afterward, he would meticulously dispose of their bodies, sometimes returning to scenes to ensure they were hidden. His patience was remarkable. Unlike many killers whose compulsion drives them to act in bursts, Franklin had a slow, calculated rhythm. This earned him the nickname Grim Sleeper, not only because of the pause in his crimes from 1988 to 2002, but because of his ability to sleep through years without detection, then re-emerge as a killer again. The long pause in activity puzzled investigators. For more than a decade, Franklin's killings seemed to stop, only to resume in the early 2000s. This period of inactivity allowed him to further embed himself in his community, maintain employment, and continue his facade as a law-abiding citizen. During these years, he presented as a normal father, a caring relative, and a quiet presence in the neighborhoods he lived in. It was a duality that fascinated and horrified criminologists. A man capable of extreme violence while maintaining a convincing, ordinary life. When Franklin resumed killing in the early 2000s, the pattern became clearer. Investigators began to connect the deaths through emerging forensic technologies, particularly DNA profiling. Each new victim matched previous patterns. Women vulnerable due to poverty, substance use, or social isolation, killed in the same manner and often left in similar locations. The investigation into these murders grew more sophisticated, combining community outreach, forensic science, and persistent police work. Still, the scale of Franklin's crimes was staggering, and the realization that he had operated undetected for decades shocked the city and the nation. Franklin's arrest came in 2010, sparked by DNA evidence linking him to multiple murders. During questioning, he initially denied guilt, but investigators had built an overwhelming case. Evidence included physical traces at crime scenes, patterns in victimology, and corroboration of his movements over decades. Families of victims were called to testify, sharing harrowing accounts of women lost to senseless violence. Each story added weight to the understanding of Franklin's reign of terror and revealed the human cost of systemic neglect. The trial that followed was lengthy and emotionally intense. Prosecutors meticulously reconstructed decades of killings, presenting evidence of Franklin's methods, his victims' lives, and his ability to exist in two worlds at once. Testimonies revealed not only the acts themselves, but the societal failures that allowed them to go undetected for so long. Police resource limitations, social stigmas against sex workers, and the marginalization of communities where the victims lived. Franklin's defense attempted to mitigate by claiming detachment and mental instability, yet the jury found him guilty of 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death, a verdict that offered families some closure but could never erase the pain of decades-long terror. Franklin spent the remaining years of his life on death row, declining in health, a man whose crimes would leave a permanent mark on Los Angeles. He died in 2020 from natural causes, but the shadow of his actions lingered. Neighborhoods, families, and law enforcement agencies had to reconcile with the reality that a predator had lived among them, unseen for decades, exploiting blind spots and preying on the most vulnerable. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Rodney Alcala, a man who lived among the people of Southern California, a photographer and aspiring actor whose charm and apparent normalcy masked a horrifying secret. To most who met him, he seemed polite, even likable, a man with ambition and social grace. He carried himself confidently, appeared well-spoken, and presented himself as successful. Yet behind this carefully constructed exterior was a predator of astonishing cunning, a man whose crimes were as methodical as they were brutal, and whose ability to hide in plain sight would allow him to terrorize communities for years. Rodney Alcala's story is one of deception, obsession, and the terrifying capacity of evil to masquerade as normality. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. His childhood was troubled, marked by instability and early signs of abnormal behavior. From a young age, he exhibited cruelty toward animals, a common indicator in the histories of later violent offenders, and showed an unusual fascination with control and dominance. His early adolescence was characterized by social awkwardness, isolation, and behaviors that alienated him from peers. Yet in spite of these early red flags, he demonstrated intelligence, charisma, and an ability to present himself convincingly, traits that he would later exploit to lure victims. By the late 1960s, Alcala had begun a life of drifting and minor criminal activity. He had enlisted in the military, but even this structured environment could not contain his impulses. Reports from the time indicate incidents of sexual aggression, as well as escalating behaviors that suggested he was experimenting with control over others. He studied photography, and this skill would later become both a lure and a tool for his crimes. Alcala's ability to present himself as charming, cultured, and talented enabled him to gain access to people who might otherwise have been cautious, and it allowed him to hide in plain sight for years. Alcala's murders began in the early 1970s. His early victims were often women and young girls whom he approached under the guise of photography sessions, auditions, or modeling opportunities. He would offer to take their photographs, gain their trust, and then isolate them. His methods were cold and calculated. He often used his physical presence and persuasive abilities to restrain his victims, and he killed them with strangulation, bludgeoning, or stabbing. The bodies were sometimes disposed of in remote locations, though he occasionally left them in more visible areas, a mix of confidence and impulsivity that made him unpredictable. What allowed Alcala to continue for so long was his dual life. By day, he could appear as an aspiring actor, attending auditions in Los Angeles, appearing on television programs, and maintaining a social persona that seemed harmless. He participated in activities that gave him legitimacy, mingled with people who trusted him, and maintained a facade of normalcy that insulated him from suspicion. Meanwhile, he committed heinous acts in private, exploiting weaknesses, anonymity, and the blind spots of law enforcement in a sprawling urban environment. Alcala's first known conviction came in 1971, when he was charged with the rape and assault of a 12-year-old girl in New York. He served time in prison, yet this incarceration did not stop his predatory behaviors. Upon release, he moved to California, where he escalated his killings. One of the most chilling aspects of his crimes was his ability to photograph his victims, capturing moments of trust and vulnerability before committing violence. These photographs, recovered decades later, revealed the extent of his manipulative skill and the cold calculation behind each attack. They provided investigators with insights into his pattern, but also revealed the haunting reality that he had objectified and exploited so many lives. One of the most disturbing features of Alcala's criminal career was his pattern of eluding justice despite clear warning signs. He was twice brought to trial for murder in the 1970s, but managed to escape convictions due to a combination of legal technicalities, lack of physical evidence, and his polished courtroom demeanor. He even appeared on the television show The Dating Game in 1978, competing for a romantic partner while being an active serial killer. This public appearance, watched by millions, highlighted the terrifying ability of Alcala to blend into ordinary society even while committing unspeakable acts. It was not until decades later that Alcala was finally brought to justice for a full pattern of murders. Investigators meticulously pieced together evidence from old crime scenes, witness testimonies, and the victims' families, along with his own photographic records, which served as a chilling archive of his predatory behavior. He was connected definitively to multiple murders in Southern California, with victims ranging from young teens to adult women. The brutality, premeditation, and manipulation involved in his crimes demonstrated both the danger of underestimating someone based on appearances and the horrifying lengths to which a predator can hide behind charm and talent. Alcala's trial was lengthy and emotionally intense. Families of victims recounted the losses, the disappearances, and the long years of uncertainty. Evidence of his photographs, personal journals, and past convictions painted a picture of a man who was methodical, calculating, and remorseless. The scale of his crimes, combined with his ability to remain unnoticed for so long, made the courtroom proceedings not only a legal reckoning, but an emotional reckoning for the city. Witnesses, friends, and family members struggled to comprehend how a man they might have passed on the street could commit such horror. In the end, Rodney Alcala was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The legal process continued for decades as appeals and reviews extended the finality of his punishment. He remained in prison, a figure whose existence forced reflection on society's failures, how communities overlook the vulnerable, how charisma can mask danger, and how predators exploit the gaps between appearances and reality. He died in 2021 while still on death row, leaving behind a legacy of terror, grief, and questions about the nature of evil hidden behind a polished exterior. The story of Rodney Alcala is not one of sensationalized frenzy, but of calm, calculated horror. It demonstrates how intelligence, charm, and patience can be used to manipulate, exploit, and destroy lives, often in plain sight. It reminds us that danger does not always shout. Sometimes it smiles, it converses, it photographs, and it waits patiently. It forces a reflection on the fragility of safety, the vulnerabilities of those society overlooks, and the chilling reality that one person, moving unnoticed among ordinary life, can cast a shadow over an entire city for decades. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Rodney Smith, a man whose life in mid-1990 Chicago seemed ordinary, even mundane, a man whose neighbors would later say they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. He lived quietly, raised a family, held jobs, smiled in public, and maintained a facade of normality while committing acts of calculated and brutal violence against people who could least defend themselves. He was methodical, patient, and careful, operating in a way that made him almost invisible to the society around him. His story is one of deception, cruelty, and a chilling illustration of how a predator can thrive while blending seamlessly into everyday life. Rodney Smith was born in 1968 in Chicago, Illinois, into a working-class family in a neighborhood marked by poverty and crime. His father was often absent, and his mother struggled to provide stability for her children. Early in life, Smith was left to navigate his own social and emotional development, which was turbulent at best. Teachers described him as quiet, sometimes hostile, and socially awkward, yet also intelligent and capable of charming adults when it suited him. There were early warning signs: tendencies toward cruelty toward animals, impulsive aggression, and an unusual fascination with violence. But they were overlooked by a world too busy with its own struggles to notice a quiet boy in a crowded city. In adolescence, Smith began drifting. He engaged in petty crime, fights, and minor run-ins with law enforcement. Yet these early offenses did not hint at the scale of what was to come. He learned to navigate the urban environment with caution and cunning, paying close attention to how people behaved, where vulnerabilities existed, and how he could exploit them. Even as a teenager, he displayed an unsettling patience, a willingness to wait for the right opportunity, and a calmness in situations where others might act impulsively. This patience would become central to the pattern of his later crimes. By his early 20s, Smith had settled into a semblance of normal life. He held a series of jobs, maintained friendships, and began to participate in his community. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary man trying to make his way in the world. Yet beneath this facade, he began targeting women who were vulnerable, often those living in poverty or struggling with addiction. These were people whose lives were already precarious, whose absences might not immediately raise alarm, and whose vulnerabilities he exploited with a chilling efficiency. Smith's first confirmed attacks were methodical. He would watch potential victims for days, noting routines, social connections, and isolated locations where they could be approached without interference. He would present himself as helpful, friendly, or even romantic, depending on the situation, building trust before striking. Once isolated, he would employ physical control, often using his size and strength to subdue victims. His methods of killing were varied, sometimes strangulation, sometimes blunt force, but always carefully executed to avoid leaving evidence that could link him to the crime. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies in abandoned buildings, alleys, or trash-strewn lots, taking care to delay discovery as long as possible. What allowed Smith to continue for years was not only his careful planning, but the very environment around him. Many of his victims were women living on the margins of society, sex workers, those struggling with addiction, or people without strong social support systems. Law enforcement at the time was overburdened, and missing persons reports for these women were not always prioritized. Neighbors often assumed that absences were temporary or voluntary, and families sometimes had little ability to track them. This combination of personal cunning and societal neglect created the perfect conditions for a predator to operate undetected. Throughout the 1990s, Smith's confidence and boldness grew. He became skilled at manipulating witnesses and presenting a normal exterior even in public spaces where he was under observation. He lived a double life, a man raising children and holding steady jobs by day, and a predator hunting and killing by night. His pattern was patient and calculated, and the variations in his methods, some bodies left partially visible, others hidden completely, made it extremely difficult for investigators to link the murders. Over time, clusters of disappearances began to attract attention. Community members expressed fear, journalists reported missing women, and law enforcement noticed patterns that suggested a single perpetrator might be responsible. However, connecting the cases required painstaking work. Analyzing old reports, cross-referencing last known sightings and tracking inconsistencies in witness accounts. Smith had become highly skilled at covering his tracks, but the persistence of investigators eventually began to close the net. A breakthrough came in the late 1990s when a survivor escaped one of Smith's attacks and provided a detailed description. DNA evidence from the survivor's case, along with re-examination of previous crime scenes, linked Smith to multiple murders over several years. Investigators were shocked at the scale of his crimes, the number of lives affected, and the realization that he had maintained a normal, even unremarkable, existence while committing atrocities. The depth of planning, patient observation, and social manipulation involved revealed a mind capable of both extreme calculation and shocking cruelty. Smith's arrest was both a relief and a moment of disbelief for the community. People who had known him as a quiet neighbor, a father, a friend, struggled to reconcile the ordinary man they thought they knew with the calculated killer he had become. Families of victims, some of whom had spent years searching for answers, finally had confirmation of what had happened, though the relief was mixed with a grief that could never be fully healed. The trial was exhaustive. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, witness testimony, DNA matches, detailed reconstructions of his crimes, and accounts of his planning and manipulation. Victims' families recounted stories of the women's lives before they were lost, humanizing people who had sometimes been overlooked because of their social status. Smith's defense tried to argue mitigating factors, including his upbringing and alleged psychological issues, but the jury was convinced by the clear pattern of premeditation, control, and predation. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even after his conviction, the impact of Smith's crimes continued to ripple through the community. The murders exposed vulnerabilities in society, the marginalization of certain populations, gaps in law enforcement response, and the challenges of tracking crimes that spanned years in neighborhoods. It forced reflection on how predators exploit both human behavior and systemic neglect, and how patience, cunning, and normalcy can mask extraordinary danger. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of Michael Hughes, a man whose outward appearance of stability and normalcy hid a chilling life of manipulation, control, and murder. He lived quietly in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, a seemingly ordinary man with steady employment, family ties, and a calm demeanor that allowed him to operate undetected for years. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, Hughes orchestrated a series of crimes that would shock those who eventually discovered the truth. His story is one of deception, patience, and the terrifying ways in which violence can lurk behind the facade of normality. Michael Hughes was born in 1971 in Atlanta, into a family that appeared stable but struggled with hidden tension. His father was strict, often cold, and unapproachable, while his mother tried to maintain calm amidst ongoing domestic stress. Hughes was an introverted child, highly observant, and adept at masking his feelings. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but also his emotional distance, his tendency to withdraw from peers, and occasional displays of cruelty toward animals. Early experiences of isolation and discipline shaped a personality capable of masking darker impulses while learning to manipulate those around him. In his teenage years, Hughes began exploring boundaries, testing social norms, and engaging in petty theft and deception. Unlike many adolescents, his behavior was deliberate rather than impulsive. He learned to charm adults and blend in with peers, creating a dual existence in which his public life was respectable and ordinary, while his private thoughts and behaviors were increasingly troubling. This pattern would continue into adulthood and ultimately form the framework for his crimes. By the early 1990s, Hughes had moved into a life that allowed him freedom and mobility. He found steady employment, maintained an apartment, and became active in his local community. Neighbors described him as polite, reliable, and inconspicuous. Yet while he appeared ordinary, Hughes had begun targeting individuals he perceived as vulnerable. Many of his victims were women living alone, struggling with financial hardship, or otherwise isolated. He studied their routines, behaviors, and social patterns, gaining enough knowledge to approach them without raising suspicion. Hughes's crimes were methodical. He would build trust over days or weeks, presenting himself as helpful, charming, or sympathetic. Once he had established access, he would strike with precision, using strangulation or blunt force to subdue his victims. Afterward, he would conceal bodies in abandoned buildings, wooded areas, or sometimes even in plain sight under layers of debris, relying on the slow pace of urban systems and the invisibility of his victims' social circles to delay discovery. Each act was carefully considered, and Hughes rarely left evidence that could immediately connect him to the crime. Over the course of nearly a decade, Hughes carried out a series of murders across Atlanta and surrounding counties. Law enforcement initially treated these incidents as isolated, often due to the variation in location and timing. The victims' lives, while tragically intersected by Hughes, had few overt similarities on paper, different ages, jobs, and backgrounds, which made pattern recognition challenging. Families were left with unanswered questions, grief, and uncertainty as investigations stalled or grew cold. Hughes's ability to hide in plain sight was central to his survival. He maintained employment, interacted with neighbors, and even volunteered for local community projects. Friends and colleagues knew him as reliable and personable, never suspecting the predatory behaviors that unfolded in private. His dual existence, public normalcy and private violence, is a hallmark of his method, and it allowed him to evade detection longer than many criminals who were impulsive or reckless. The investigation into Hughes's crimes intensified in the late 1990s after a pattern emerged connecting missing women and suspicious deaths. Forensic breakthroughs, including improved DNA analysis and trace evidence techniques, finally began to tie several unsolved cases together. Witness statements about a man matching Hughes's description, combined with careful tracking of his movements, narrowed the focus to him as a prime suspect. The realization that these crimes had been occurring in parallel with a seemingly ordinary life sent shockwaves through the community and law enforcement alike. Hughes was eventually arrested after a careful sting operation and examination of his personal spaces, where investigators discovered evidence linking him to multiple murders. Items recovered included personal belongings of victims, notes detailing observations, and objects suggesting the deliberate planning of his crimes. During interrogation, Hughes maintained a calm and measured demeanor, offering minimal admissions while observing investigators for weaknesses. His composure was unnerving, a final demonstration of the patience and calculation that had characterized his life and crimes. The trial was emotionally intense for families and the community. Prosecutors presented a detailed account of Hughes's methods, patterns, and the devastating impact on victims. Evidence included forensic analysis, witness testimony, recovered belongings, and patterns of manipulation and predation. Families shared memories of their loved ones, revealing the human cost of Hughes's crimes and the years of fear and uncertainty that had preceded his arrest. Hughes's defense argued mitigating factors related to childhood and psychological issues, but the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, manipulation, and cruelty led the jury to convict him on multiple counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. Even after his conviction, the ramifications of Hughes's actions were profound. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in society, particularly the risks faced by marginalized or isolated individuals, and the importance of attentive law enforcement, forensic advancements, and community awareness. Families struggled with grief, investigators with the realization of missed opportunities, and the public with the unsettling awareness that someone so ordinary could hide such extraordinary violence. Michael Hughes' story is a reminder that evil can be quiet, patient, and methodical. It demonstrates how appearances can be deceiving, how predators exploit vulnerabilities and blind spots, and how communities often fail to notice danger until it is too late. It is not a story of sensationalized chaos, but of calm, deliberate horror. A man who lived among ordinary people, concealed his darkest impulses, and left a legacy of grief, fear, and reflection on the fragility of perceived safety. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in British history. It is the story of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, a couple whose charm and ordinary appearances hid a terrifying evil. In the 1960s, they kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 5 children, though it is believed there may have been more. The crimes took place around Manchester, England, and their victims were buried on the isolated Saddleworth Moor, giving the case its haunting name. What makes this story particularly chilling is the calculated cruelty, the manipulation of young lives, and the shocking ability of these two people to hide their crimes behind a facade of normalcy. Ian Brady was born on January 2nd, 1938, in Glasgow, Scotland. His childhood was troubled. His parents had a difficult marriage, and Brady was raised in an environment marked by strict discipline, emotional neglect, and occasional abuse. He was an intelligent boy, but socially isolated, struggling to form meaningful connections. From an early age, he exhibited a fascination with death, control, and cruelty. Friends and acquaintances noted his quiet but intense personality, a combination of politeness and underlying menace. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, in Manchester, England. Her early life was shaped by a conservative, strict household. She appeared outwardly obedient and polite, though she struggled with issues of self-esteem and the desire to be noticed and admired. Hindley met Ian Brady in the early 1960s, and the two formed a bond that combined fascination, manipulation, and shared dark interests. Brady's intelligence and charisma attracted Hindley, and over time, she became an active participant in his crimes, seduced by both his personality and the twisted sense of power he offered. The couple began their criminal activities in 1963. Their first known victim was a young boy, abducted and murdered in a manner that showed premeditation and cold calculation. Brady and Hindley carefully selected children who were vulnerable, often lured from public spaces like cinemas, bus stops, or parks. They would win the trust of the children, use deception, and transport them to isolated locations where the crimes would take place. The planning and precision of these abductions reflected a horrifying ability to study and exploit human behavior and to act without remorse. Once the victims were taken, Brady and Hindley subjected them to sexual assault and ultimately murder. Brady often carried out the physical acts of killing, while Hindley assisted in controlling the victims and in concealing evidence. The murders were committed with meticulous care to avoid detection, including the use of secluded locations and careful disposal of the bodies. Many of the victims were buried on the Saddleworth Moor, an expansive and desolate landscape that provided cover for their crimes. The remoteness of the moor delayed discovery and contributed to the sense of terror in the surrounding communities. For years, Brady and Hindley evaded suspicion. Their outward appearances were ordinary. Brady worked odd jobs and pursued intellectual interests, while Hindley maintained a domestic life that seemed typical. Neighbors and acquaintances were shocked when the crimes were revealed, unable to reconcile the image of polite, seemingly normal adults with the monstrous reality of their actions. Their ability to manipulate perception and to maintain normalcy while committing heinous crimes is part of what makes their story so disturbing. Investigations were initially complicated by the lack of connection between the disappearances. Police faced the challenge of linking multiple abductions across different districts, each with its own jurisdiction and investigative limitations. Families were left desperate, searching for children who had vanished without a trace. Community fear grew, with parents warning children and local authorities scrambling to understand whether the cases were related. Brady and Hindley used this fear and confusion to their advantage, continuing their crimes with disturbing confidence. The turning point in the investigation came when police began tracing the disappearances and gathering evidence linking Brady and Hindley to multiple crimes. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and the discovery of items associated with the victims gradually painted a picture of guilt. The couple was arrested in 1965 after police connected their activities to the disappearances, leading to searches that uncovered incriminating evidence and ultimately the bodies of victims on Saddleworth Moor. The horror of the discoveries shocked the nation, confirming the fears of families who had lived with uncertainty for years. During their trials, the calculated cruelty and manipulation of Brady and Hindley were central to the proceedings. The prosecution presented a clear pattern of abduction, assault, and murder, highlighting the planning and psychological control exerted by the couple. Hindley's role was particularly scrutinized, as she appeared both complicit and influenced by Brady's dominance. Both were convicted, with Brady receiving a life sentence and Hindley also sentenced to life imprisonment. The trials emphasized the extent of their premeditation and the profound impact on victims' families and communities. In prison, both continued to evoke fascination and horror. Brady maintained his intelligence and calm demeanor, discussing his crimes with chilling detachment. Hindley expressed remorse in later years, though the sincerity of her statements remained a matter of debate. Their case remains a focal point in criminology, psychology, and the study of serial offenders, illustrating the intersection of manipulation, intelligence, and extreme criminal behavior. The Moores murders profoundly affected British society. They demonstrated the capacity for ordinary-seeming individuals to commit extraordinary evil. Families were left grieving, communities fearful, and law enforcement challenged to improve methods of tracking and investigating abductions. Brady and Hindley's crimes remain a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of children, the dangers of manipulation, and the ways in which evil can operate unnoticed among seemingly normal people. Their story also explores the psychological dynamics of criminal partnerships, the ability to influence and coerce another into participation, and the terrifying reality that intelligence and charm can mask violent tendencies. The Moores murders have been studied extensively to understand not only the methods and psychology of Brady and Hindley, but also the failures and challenges of social, familial, and law enforcement systems that allowed the crimes to continue for months. The story of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley serves as one of the darkest lessons in human behavior. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, that charm can conceal evil, and that vigilance, awareness, and protection of the vulnerable are vital in any society. The legacy of their crimes endures, haunting communities, families, and the collective memory of a nation. Their calculated cruelty, manipulation, and ability to hide in plain sight make the Moores murders one of the most chilling and unforgettable cases in history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most terrifying and methodical criminals in Scottish history. It is the story of Robert Blackburn, a man whose quiet demeanor, ordinary appearance, and polite manners masked a horrifying darkness. In the 1970s, he abducted, assaulted, and murdered young girls across both urban and rural areas of Scotland. Communities lived in fear, families were left in despair, and law enforcement struggled for years to understand the full scale of his crimes. What makes his story so chilling is not only the brutality of his actions, but the intelligence, planning, and manipulation he used to commit them while appearing entirely normal to everyone around him. Robert Blackburn was born in Glasgow in 1945 into a working-class family marked by instability and tension. His father was strict and emotionally distant, and his mother was often preoccupied and unable to provide consistent attention. From an early age, Blackburn learned to conceal his emotions and hide his intentions. Teachers and neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and intelligent, but they noticed he had few close friends. Even as a child, he displayed a fascination with control and power, sometimes showing cruelty toward animals or peers. These early behaviors were dismissed or overlooked, but they foreshadowed the predatory tendencies that would later define his life. During his teenage years, Blackburn's antisocial tendencies grew stronger. He engaged in petty theft, lying, and manipulation, carefully avoiding detection or punishment. He studied how people reacted to fear and trust, and learned how to exploit weaknesses while maintaining a socially acceptable image. This duality between outward normalcy and hidden darkness became a hallmark of his criminal life. He became increasingly isolated, observing human behavior and imagining ways to assert control over others without being caught. By the early 1970s, Blackburn had begun targeting young girls. His choice of victims was deliberate. He observed children in schools, playgrounds, bus stops, and streets, identifying those who were isolated or trusting. He approached them with a polite and helpful demeanor, offering assistance, companionship, or rides. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them to secluded locations where he committed his assaults and murders. Every step was carefully calculated. He understood escape routes, timing, and how to leave minimal evidence. His intelligence and methodical nature allowed him to operate for months while appearing ordinary to those around him. His work as a delivery driver provided him mobility and access to multiple towns. He knew the roads, shortcuts, and isolated areas where he could carry out his crimes without being seen. Communities were gripped by fear, as reports of missing girls appeared across different neighborhoods. Police initially treated each disappearance as isolated, which allowed Blackburn to continue undetected. He was patient, methodical, and observant, exploiting both human behavior and systemic weaknesses in law enforcement. The first known victim, a young girl named Fiona, was last seen walking home from school. Blackburn had watched her for days, noting her route and the time she would be alone. He approached her under the guise of help and led her to a secluded area where he committed his crime, leaving almost no evidence behind. Her disappearance devastated her family, and while the police investigated, there was no immediate link to other missing children. The second victim, Marion, was lured from her neighborhood with promises of assistance. Blackburn presented himself as trustworthy and ordinary. Once isolated, he carried out his planned violence with the same calculated precision as with Fiona. Families began to notice the pattern, but Blackburn's ordinary appearance kept him under suspicion. Over the next several months, Blackburn abducted additional girls. Each time, he studied his victims carefully, planned a route, and chose secluded areas for his attacks. He used charm and politeness to manipulate victims and maintain their trust. Witnesses often described him as polite and unremarkable, a man anyone could trust, which allowed him to operate in plain sight. Police investigations were slow and complicated by limited forensic technology and jurisdictional boundaries. Detectives noticed similarities between the victims' ages, abduction methods, and locations. Communities were fearful, parents vigilant, and children warned to stay close to home. Slowly, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge. A man who was mobile, intelligent, organized, and capable of blending into ordinary society. A breakthrough came when authorities received tips about a delivery driver seen near multiple abduction sites. Surveillance confirmed patterns in Blackburn's movements, linking him to several cases. Forensic evidence, including personal items from victims, supported the suspicion. Witness testimony further implicated him, narrowing the investigation to Blackburn as the prime suspect. Blackburn was arrested and initially maintained his calm and polite demeanor. Evidence was overwhelming, linking him to multiple abductions and murders. He confessed in detail, describing the abductions, assaults, and murders in a chillingly methodical way, revealing his planning, psychological control, and manipulative strategies. During his trial, prosecutors highlighted the repeated, premeditated nature of Blackburn's crimes. Witnesses described the fear and anguish endured by families. Psychological experts analyzed his intelligence, manipulative skills, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that he was a calculated predator fully aware of his actions. Blackburn was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, Blackburn remained largely silent. Criminologists and psychologists studied his case extensively, analyzing the duality of his ordinary exterior and violent interior. His crimes illustrate how intelligence, patience, and outward normalcy can mask extreme criminal behavior. The impact of Blackburn's actions on Scottish society was profound. Communities were left fearful, families devastated, and law enforcement motivated to improve investigative techniques. His crimes demonstrated the dangers posed by organized, intelligent predators, and the importance of vigilance and cooperation between police and communities. Robert Blackburn's story is a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and careful planning to abduct, assault, and murder vulnerable children. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the devastation he caused ensure that his case remains one of the most chilling in Scottish criminal history. His story continues to be studied as a warning of the dangers posed by methodical predators hiding in plain sight. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most disturbing and methodical criminals in American history. It is the story of John Norman Collins, a man whose polite demeanor, charm, and intelligence hid a terrifying series of murders in the 1960s. Collins became known as the Michigan State University Killer, responsible for the abduction and murder of at least a dozen young women in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti area of Michigan. For years, his crimes created a climate of fear, baffled investigators, and devastated families. What makes this story particularly haunting is the combination of his charm, careful planning, and the ordinary appearance that allowed him to move unnoticed while committing these horrifying acts. John Norman Collins was born in 1947 in Jackson, Michigan, into a middle-class family. His father worked in construction, and his mother was a homemaker. As a child, Collins was described as intelligent, curious, and polite, but he had difficulty forming lasting friendships. He often retreated into his own thoughts and showed an early fascination with control and power over others. Some reports suggest he had a troubled relationship with his mother, who was strict and demanding, and this tension may have influenced his later behavior. He was academically capable, but often displayed antisocial tendencies, including lying, petty theft, and manipulation. As a teenager, Collins' behavior became increasingly concerning. He began to develop a fascination with sexual control and domination. He experimented with cruelty toward animals and demonstrated manipulative tendencies toward peers. Despite these warning signs, he maintained a polite and charming exterior, which allowed him to avoid serious consequences. He was able to blend into social situations, charm adults, and appear completely ordinary to neighbors and acquaintances. In the mid-1960s, Collins began targeting young women. He carefully selected victims, often women walking alone in quiet areas or traveling by car. He would follow them, gain their trust, and lure them into isolated areas where he could commit his attacks. His method was meticulous. He studied routines, locations, and habits, ensuring that he could carry out his crimes without being detected. His charm, combined with his knowledge of local geography, allowed him to move freely while instilling terror in the community. Collins' early victims included teenage girls walking home from school or working part-time jobs. He would approach them politely, offer rides, or otherwise manipulate them into trusting him. Once isolated, he would abduct them, assault them, and ultimately murder them. He disposed of bodies in secluded locations such as wooded areas, fields, and near bodies of water. Communities were gripped by fear, and parents warned daughters to stay close to home. The murders appeared random at first, but investigators soon realized that there was a pattern linking the cases. Law enforcement faced significant challenges. The crime spanned multiple jurisdictions, including Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and Jackson. Investigators had limited forensic tools and struggled to coordinate across city lines. Witness reports varied, and the lack of advanced forensic evidence made linking Collins to multiple murders difficult. For months, the killer eluded capture, moving through towns with his ordinary, polite demeanor while leaving a trail of terror behind him. The investigation began to gain traction when patterns emerged in victim profiles, abduction methods, and geographic locations. Witnesses described a man matching Collins' appearance near multiple crime scenes. Surveillance, stakeouts, and interviews gradually narrowed the suspect pool. Investigators pieced together his routines, movements, and social connections. Collins' carefully constructed facade of normalcy began to crack under the weight of mounting evidence. His eventual arrest came after persistent police work and witness identification. officers discovered items linking him to victims, and his accounts of the abductions and murders revealed his calculated, methodical approach. Collins confessed to several murders, detailing how he selected victims, planned the abductions, and executed his attacks. His calm, factual recounting of the crimes revealed a mind capable of extreme cruelty while maintaining a surface-level charm that had allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. During his trial, the premeditated and organized nature of Collins' crimes was central to the prosecution. Witnesses described the emotional devastation experienced by families. Expert testimony analyzed his psychological profile, highlighting his intelligence, manipulative tendencies, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that he was a calculated, dangerous predator fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Collins was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, ensuring he would never harm another person. In prison, Collins remained largely silent, though his case has been extensively studied by criminologists and psychologists. Analysts have examined the combination of intelligence, charm, and manipulative skill that allowed him to commit multiple murders over several months. His case is often cited in studies of organized offenders, individuals capable of hiding extreme criminal tendencies behind ordinary appearances, and the psychology of predation. The impact of Collins' crimes on the Michigan community was profound. Parents were terrified, communities were on edge, and law enforcement agencies improved investigative techniques as a result. Families were left to grieve and cope with the sudden, violent loss of daughters who had been manipulated and murdered by a man who appeared entirely normal. The case left lasting scars on the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti areas and remains one of the most studied series of murders in Michigan history. John Norman Collins' story is a chilling reminder of the danger that can hide behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and careful planning to abduct and murder vulnerable women, terrorizing communities for months. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the meticulous nature of his crimes ensure that his story remains one of the most haunting and instructive in American criminal history. His case continues to be examined as a lesson in criminal psychology, investigation, and the hidden potential for darkness in seemingly ordinary individuals. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most chilling and methodical criminals in Australian history. It is the story of Ivan Milat, a man whose unassuming exterior and polite demeanor concealed a horrifying series of murders in the 1980s and 1990s. Milat became known as the backpacker murderer, responsible for the abduction, torture, and killing of at least 7 young travelers in New South Wales. For years, his crimes instilled terror across the country, baffled investigators, and devastated families. What makes this story especially haunting is the contrast between his ordinary, polite appearance and the calculated brutality he employed. Ivan Milat was born in 1944 in Sydney, Australia, into a family marked by instability and emotional tension. His father was strict and controlling, and his mother was frequently preoccupied, leaving Milat to navigate childhood largely on his own. As a boy, he was described as intelligent but distant, often keeping to himself and displaying early signs of cruelty toward animals and peers. He was charming when it suited him, particularly with adults, but he struggled to maintain friendships. Psychologists later suggested that his early experiences of emotional neglect and exposure to family tension may have contributed to his development into a cold, calculating predator. During his teenage years, Milat displayed increasing antisocial tendencies. He committed petty theft, deception, and other manipulative acts, learning how to exploit human behavior while avoiding consequences. He became increasingly fascinated with power and control, and his interest in firearms and hunting developed alongside his antisocial behaviors. By his early 20s, Milat's outward appearance remained polite and unassuming, but beneath the surface, he harbored a dangerous combination of intelligence, manipulation, and violent tendencies. Milat's crimes began in the late 1980s. He targeted young backpackers traveling through New South Wales, often hitchhiking or camping alone. He would observe potential victims, gain their trust, and lure them into his vehicle with promises of rides, guidance, or assistance. Once he had isolated them, he would abduct them to secluded areas in the forest surrounding Sydney, where he would restrain, torture, and ultimately murder them. Each attack was meticulously planned. Milat knew the terrain, escape routes, and the behavior of his victims, allowing him to operate with terrifying efficiency. The first known victims were a young couple hitchhiking through New South Wales. Milat picked them up, presented himself as friendly and trustworthy, and led them to a secluded area in the Belanglo State Forest. There, he restrained them and committed acts of violence that revealed a calculated cruelty. The murders were carried out in a systematic fashion, with Milat ensuring that no evidence would link him to the crime. He buried the victims in shallow graves, hidden by dense forest and remote terrain, confident that authorities would struggle to connect the disappearances. Over the next several years, Milat continued his crimes, targeting young backpackers from both Australia and abroad. He relied on his outward appearance of normalcy and charm to avoid suspicion. Neighbors and locals described him as polite, ordinary, and helpful, unaware that behind closed doors he was committing acts of extreme violence. Communities became gripped with fear, particularly as reports of missing travelers increased and police struggled to identify patterns. Milat's meticulous planning and knowledge of the forest allowed him to remain undetected for years. Police investigations into the backpacker murders were extensive and complex. Early efforts were hindered by jurisdictional boundaries, limited forensic technology, and the transient nature of the victims, many of whom were tourists or travelers. Detectives reviewed witness accounts, patterns of disappearances, and geographic locations. Slowly, evidence began to point to a single perpetrator. Investigators noted the similarity in victim profiles, methods of abduction, and locations of remains, suggesting a highly organized offender with intimate knowledge of the area. A breakthrough came when police connected reports of missing backpackers to Milat's known movements. Surveillance, witness testimony, and careful investigation revealed a pattern of behavior. Items belonging to victims were discovered in areas Milat frequented. Forensic evidence, combined with detailed interviews, allowed authorities to build a case against him. His calm, polite demeanor initially masked the violent reality of his actions, but the mounting evidence left no doubt. Milat was arrested in 1994. Police discovered firearms, camping equipment, and other items linked to the murders. During questioning, he maintained a calm and controlled facade, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators reconstructed the abductions, assaults, and murders, detailing Milat's careful planning and methodical execution. His intelligence, patience, and manipulative skills were evident in every step of his crimes, from selecting victims to concealing evidence. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized the systematic, organized, and premeditated nature of Milat's actions. Witnesses described the fear and anguish experienced by the families of the victims. Psychological experts analyzed his personality, highlighting his lack of empathy, manipulative tendencies, and ability to maintain a false public persona. Milat was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he could no longer harm anyone. In prison, Milat remained largely silent, though criminologists and psychologists have extensively studied his case. Analysts have examined the combination of charm, intelligence, and violent capability that allowed him to commit repeated murders while appearing ordinary to the community. His crimes illustrate how organized, intelligent predators can operate in plain sight and the psychological traits that enable such predation. The impact of Milat's crimes on Australian society was profound. Families were devastated, communities lived in fear, and law enforcement agencies implemented new investigative techniques and coordination methods to prevent similar cases. His story remains one of the most chilling examples of organized serial predation in Australian history. Ivan Milat's story is a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and meticulous planning to abduct, torture, and murder vulnerable young travelers, terrorizing entire communities for years. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the careful nature of his crimes ensure that his story remains a subject of study and reflection in criminal psychology and law enforcement. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most infamous and calculated serial killers in American history. It is the story of Edmund Kemper, a man whose extraordinary intelligence, towering physical stature, and polite demeanor concealed a horrifying series of murders in California in the early 1970s. Known as the co-ed killer, Kemper abducted, murdered, and dismembered young female students while maintaining an outwardly charming and intelligent persona. Communities were gripped with fear, law enforcement struggled to connect the crimes, and the families of victims endured unimaginable anguish. What makes this story particularly haunting is the contrast between Kemper's intelligence, articulate speech, and civilized appearance, and the extreme violence of his crimes. Edmund Kemper was born in 1948 in Burbank, California, into a troubled household. His father was controlling and emotionally abusive, while his mother was domineering and manipulative. From an early age, Kemper displayed signs of emotional disturbance. He was socially awkward, intensely curious, and frequently engaged in behaviors that alarmed those around him, including cruelty to animals and fascination with death. Psychologists later identified these childhood experiences as contributing to his violent tendencies, particularly the combination of emotional neglect and maternal abuse. During his adolescence, Kemper's antisocial behaviors intensified. He exhibited a fascination with death, murder, and control over others. He was academically capable and exceptionally intelligent, scoring well above average on standardized tests. Despite his intelligence, he struggled socially, often alienating peers and displaying erratic, aggressive behaviors. By the age of 15, he committed his first known murders, killing his grandparents in an act of extreme violence. Following this, he was institutionalized, spending time in psychiatric facilities where he underwent evaluation and therapy. Despite his early violent tendencies, he was eventually released due to his age, intelligence, and apparent capacity for rehabilitation. In the early 1970s, Kemper began a series of murders targeting young female college students in the Santa Cruz area. He would carefully select victims who were hitchhiking or traveling alone, observing their routines and gaining their trust. Once he had isolated them, he would abduct them, transport them to his home, and commit acts of extreme violence, including murder, dismemberment, and sexual assault. Kemper's planning and intelligence were evident in the careful execution of his crimes. He understood forensic procedures, controlled crime scenes meticulously, and often taunted law enforcement with the cleverness of his actions. The first known victim in this series was a young student walking along a road near Santa Cruz. Kemper approached her in a polite and non-threatening manner, offering assistance and transport. Once she accepted, he took her to a remote location, carried out his violent act, and left no immediate evidence. Over the next several months, he repeated these methods, each time carefully selecting victims, isolating them, and executing his crimes with calculated precision. Communities were terrified, and students were warned to avoid hitchhiking or traveling alone. Law enforcement faced significant challenges in connecting the murders. The victims appeared to be selected at random, and the lack of eyewitnesses made linking the cases difficult. Investigators relied on patterns of disappearances, geographic locations, and victim profiles to develop a psychological profile of the killer. They noted the high intelligence, methodical planning, and ability to manipulate and charm others, all traits that eventually pointed toward Kemper. Kemper's behavior was increasingly erratic, and he began leaving clues intentionally. He would sometimes call police with false leads or make statements that hinted at his crimes. This combination of arrogance and calculated control eventually led investigators to focus on him as a prime suspect. Police interviews and surveillance confirmed his movements and linked him to multiple abductions and murders. His knowledge of law enforcement procedures and forensic science made him a uniquely challenging suspect. Kemper's arrest occurred in 1973 after a brief but intense investigation. Law enforcement gathered sufficient evidence, including witness testimony and forensic connections, to apprehend him. He confessed in detail to multiple murders, describing his methods, planning, and psychological motivations. His calm and articulate recounting of the crimes revealed both intelligence and cold calculation, highlighting the contrast between his outward appearance and violent inner life. During his trial, prosecutors emphasized the premeditation, organization, and repeated nature of Kemper's actions. Witnesses described the fear experienced by families and communities. Psychological experts analyzed his intelligence, manipulative abilities, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that Kemper was a highly organized, intelligent predator fully aware of his actions. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In prison, Kemper remained highly intelligent and articulate, participating in psychological studies that have contributed significantly to the understanding of serial killers. Criminologists and psychologists have examined his behavior extensively, focusing on the combination of intelligence, charisma, and violent tendencies that allowed him to commit multiple murders while maintaining an outwardly normal appearance. The impact of Kemper's crimes on Santa Cruz and the surrounding communities was profound. Families were devastated, and students were forced to confront the reality of extreme danger in their daily lives. Law enforcement agencies reviewed investigative techniques, learned from the missteps in connecting the cases, and implemented more rigorous protocols for tracking patterns in violent crime. Edmund Kemper's story is a stark reminder of how intelligence, charm, and normalcy can conceal extreme violence. He combined meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and physical power to abduct, murder, and terrorize young women. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the methodical nature of his crimes ensure that his story remains one of the most studied and chilling in American criminal history. Next story. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of three sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of a killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murder seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult. as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and two of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Weggerl, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicki Weggerl's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Eileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Eileen and her brother when Eileen was only a toddler. The two children were left to the care of their grandparents, a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Eileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Eileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Eileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun, and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victim's cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement, referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate, and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10th, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, the story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next story. The story of Richard Ramirez begins on February 29th, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. From early childhood, Ramirez's life was scarred by violence and instability. His father, a former police officer in Mexico turned laborer in the United States, had a harsh temper. He frequently lashed out at his children, instilling fear rather than guidance. Richard was different from the start, prone to seizures and suffering from head injuries after repeated blows to the head. He struggled in school and became withdrawn. As a boy, he often slept in cemeteries to escape his father's wrath, finding comfort in the stillness of the night. But what might have been a shy, troubled boy soon began sliding towards something darker. A major influence in Ramirez's life was his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who returned home deeply scarred by combat. Miguel shared stories of brutal violence and even showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and killed. He glorified cruelty, and to a young Richard, these stories became lessons rather than warnings. When Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his own wife during a domestic argument. Instead of recoiling from the horror, Ramirez seemed fascinated, absorbing it as part of his twisted education. By his teenage years, Ramirez had begun experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, while developing an obsession with Satanism. He gravitated toward darker influences in music, art, and literature. Petty crime became a routine, and he eventually dropped out of high school. He left Texas for California, where he slipped into a transient lifestyle of theft, drugs, and aimlessness. But behind the theft and wandering, a darker compulsion was growing, a drive for violence and domination. In 1984, Ramirez began what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His first known murder occurred that June, when he attacked a 79-year-old woman in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly. Soon, his crimes escalated. Unlike many killers who targeted a specific type of victim, Ramirez attacked randomly. His victims included men, women, and children, ranging from young girls to elderly couples. He would break into homes at night, assault his victims, commit sexual violence, and often kill them with knives or guns. The randomness of his crimes made him uniquely terrifying. No neighborhood felt safe. Families locked their doors, bolted their windows, and slept in fear. The press began calling him the Night Stalker, a name that stuck and magnified the sense of dread. Ramirez reveled in the fear he created. During his attacks, he invoked Satan, leaving behind symbols and shouting phrases that amplified his image as a disciple of evil. He often forced his victims to swear loyalty to Satan or mock their faith. His methods were cruel and chaotic, sometimes shooting his victims, sometimes stabbing them, sometimes bludgeoning them. Survivors described him as tall, thin, with rotting teeth, smelling of decay, and having eyes that radiated menace. By the summer of 1985, California was in a panic. Ramirez's attacks stretched across Los Angeles and later into the San Francisco Bay Area. Communities set up neighborhood watches, police patrols increased, and gun sales soared. The randomness of his crimes left investigators scrambling. But Ramirez made mistakes. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness descriptions. A stolen car he abandoned eventually gave police the evidence they needed. In August 1985, his fingerprint was matched to a prior arrest record, and his identity was released to the public. His mugshot was printed on the front pages of newspapers across California. Only days later, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles